Musical sponsor for this episode of the Bible Beer Consortium is Mike Rowe.
Tonight's speakers. First, Dr. Justin Bass. Dr. Justin Bass is a PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary in New Testament Studies. His recent book is entitled The Battle for the Keys, Revelation 1, verse 18, and Christ's Ascent into the Underworld. He's received a Master's of Theology from DTS and a business degree in entrepreneurship from Southern Methodist University. Dr. Bass is currently the lead pastor of 1042 Church in Frisco and a professor at Dallas Christian College and Dallas Theological Seminary. I thought I went completely deaf for a split second. When he's not working, he's reading, watching movies, usually Lord of the Rings, and spending time with his high school sweetheart, Allison Bass, and their two kids, Ariana, age 5, and Christian, age 2. Presenting tonight's topic, Jesus of Nazareth, Lord or Legend. Please welcome Dr. Justin Bass.
Am I on? Hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Ezra. I want to give another round of applause if we could for Ezra, because this wouldn't be happening without him. I keep telling Ezra that I want the motto for these BBC debates specifically to be, I disagree with you, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't make you Hitler. By the way, I'm not going to mention Hitler again tonight. I make that vow to you, unless you provoke me. First, I want to thank Dan for flying out here to be a part of this debate. When Ezra and I were working on finding a debate dialogue partner for me, I said I wanted a true representative of atheism. True representative. Not some undecided agnostic. As the great philosopher and theologian Stephen Colbert said, an agnostic is just an atheist without balls. And I think no one can deny that we have here one of the best representatives of atheism and free thought in America today, here with us, Dan Barker. So really thank you for coming, Dan. We had a great dinner last night. We tried to get our waitress to come to this debate, but she had to work, unfortunately. But we asked her, who do you think's the atheist, who do you think's the Christian? And she thought I was the atheist, and she thought Dan was the Christian. That was fun. If you came here tonight to find out who the better debater is, let me just tell you right up front, it's Dan. He's had over 100 debates. I've had one. This is my second one. But let me tell you, I want you to know, and I want Dan to know that I've debated over 1,000 times on Facebook. And I wish you could have read some of those threads. I killed it. I've watched everything I could with Dan over the last few months, and I think the 15-minute speech he gave at the Oxford Union debates, if you haven't watched that, you need to. That's the best I've seen from him. I told him that last night. In fact, I quote the King James, which he used to preach from, almost thou persuades me to be an atheist. But I listened to John Lennox's talk, who also talked there, and he brought me back to my senses. So let it be said right here and now who the better debater is. It's Dan Barker. But if you came here seeking the truth, then you should listen to me. I'm going to lay out historical evidence for my case that Jesus is Lord, and I challenge you to follow the evidence where it leads. Raise your hand if you are a seeker of the truth in general. If you're not raising your hand, you can't buy any more alcohol, by the way. To paraphrase Paul, To paraphrase Paul, this altar to the unknown truth you seek, I am here to proclaim to you. His name is Jesus Christ, and he is Lord of all. Before I lay out the best case I can in 20 minutes to demonstrate to you that Jesus is Lord, I'd like to first offer the unbelievers in the room an alternative, a secular approach, if you will, to this Jesus of Nazareth. Sam Harris has said on many occasions that Jesus of Nazareth must have been the Michael Jordan of compassion. I really like that. Who could deny if the whole world lived according to the Sermon on the Mount and the parable of the Good Samaritan, even lived like Christ, walked like he did, we would have a perfect world. In fact, Jesus also left an unparalleled footprint on planet Earth. He didn't just say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He actually lived it out. When Jesus was being nailed to a cross, he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. This is completely unique in all human history. You won't find anyone contemporary with Jesus or before Jesus who said that, who forgave the enemies while they murdered him. It was utterances such as these that inspired Leo Tolstoy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. toward nonviolent revolutions that have transformed nations and countless hearts and minds. So don't disregard Jesus just because he claimed to be the Son of God or is in the Bible. Study his teachings. Look to his example. If there ever was a perfect humanist, if there was a LeBron James of compassion, it was him. Now allow me to lay out some of the strongest evidence I know that Jesus is Lord. I'm well aware that I won't convince many of you that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, at least not tonight. But you should listen carefully to some of the foundational reasons why a third of planet Earth still worships this Jesus as Lord. In fact, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection and divinity is so compelling that not only has countless skeptics followed the evidence where it leads and converted to Christianity, but even the late Jewish scholar named Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University, wrote a book arguing that Jesus of Nazareth did in fact rise from the dead. In fact, this is the book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish perspective. He actually remained an Orthodox Jew, even though he believed, according to the evidence, that the God of Israel raised Jesus from the dead. He just wasn't convinced this proved Jesus was the Messiah, but only paved the way for the Messiah to come. Lapid did say if Jesus ended up being the coming Messiah, he would be fine with that, which is nice. I think it's pretty rare for adherents of one religion to believe the central claim of another religion, isn't it? I mean, do any non-Mormons believe that Joseph Smith was a true prophet? Do any non-Muslims accept the supernatural claims concerning Muhammad that he flew into heaven on a horse? Are there any non-Scientologists who believe there was once an overlord named Xeno? Actually, are there even Scientologists who believe this? I don't even think Scientologists believe in Scientology, but that's a talk for another time. But there are non-Christians who accept the resurrection of Jesus. How can I demonstrate to you that Jesus of Nazareth is Lord of the world? Other than the resurrection, the other key argument that Christians have used over the last 2,000 years to convince skeptics has been the fact that Jesus has fulfilled a number of prophecies written hundreds, even 1,000 years before he was born. I wish I had time to share some of those from Isaiah and from Micah and from Daniel, but I don't have the time in this opening talk, so you can maybe ask me in the Q&A. But my primary case tonight that Jesus is Lord is built on 7 historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth that is agreed upon by every teaching scholar in the Western world, whether in classics, whether in history, whether in early Christianity, or biblical studies. And you heard me right, I said all teaching scholars in those fields except, that are full-time teaching on faculty, accept those as facts. Now to be clear, we can't be absolutely certain about anything in history. In fact, we can't even be absolutely certain we are here in Dallas right now. Of course, we could be in the Matrix, right? But if you believe that we are here in Dallas, and if we can know things actually happened in history, then here are 7 facts about Jesus and his followers that emerge from using the strictest tools of the historical method. I heard Dan say in the debate with Russell Silvestri that there is no consensus among critical scholars on anything in the Bible. So I decided to not just build my case tonight that Jesus is Lord based on a consensus or a majority of critical teaching scholars in these fields, but based on all of them. In fact, I hate saying the word virtually or almost or the majority. Those words are really annoying. So I'm not going to use those tonight. I'm going to say all. First, let me lay out my sources which these facts are based on. These sources also have the unanimous consent of scholars professionally teaching in universities and seminaries all over the world. And in fact, from my reading of Dan, he agrees with these sources that I'm about to lay out. Source number 1, Paul's earliest letters. There's actually 7 undisputed letters by Paul, but I'm going to only focus on 5 that everyone agrees he wrote. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, and Philippians. Paul's 5 letters date within 20 to 25 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Source number 2, early traditions Paul quotes from within these undisputed letters. The 2 traditions I'll primarily be referring to include a creed from 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, which Paul received from the earliest followers of Jesus, people like Peter and James and John. And this is dated by all scholars, listen carefully to me now, to within months of Jesus' crucifixion. Within months of Jesus' crucifixion. In fact, the latest I could find any scholar to date this creed is 10 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Most dated much earlier. In fact, Dan is on the conservative end of this as he dates this creed to within 2 years of the crucifixion. In fact, if you brought Godless for him to sign, it's on page 293. You can read it. The other early tradition Paul quotes is a hymn from Philippians 2, 6 through 11. This hymn in Philippians is also considered to be one of the earliest writings of Christianity from within a decade of the crucifixion. These sources give us the unalterable historical bedrock of Christianity. And by the way, these facts are immune to so-called contradictions in the Gospels or myth and legendary development if they were in them. Because as I said, some of these sources date to within months of the crucifixion of Jesus. So just to be clear, I want to make sure you understand what case I'm trying to build. Based on these earliest sources agreed upon by all teaching professors in these fields, we gained these 7 historical facts about Jesus and his earliest followers. And my claim tonight is the best explanation for these 7 facts is that Jesus did in fact bodily rise from the dead and therefore is Lord of all. Here are the facts. Fact number 1. Jesus was crucified in the early 30s AD. Robert Funk, who was the founder of the Jesus Seminar, one of the most skeptical societies of scholars studying the historical Jesus, he said Jesus' crucifixion has the bedrock of historicity. Dan gave the Emperor Has No Clothes award from the Freedom from Religion Foundation to Bart Ehrman not too long ago. And Bart Ehrman's speech is on the YouTube. You need to listen to it. It's very good. But a person in the audience said to him that he didn't think there was evidence for the historical Jesus. Not a good thing to say to Bart Ehrman. If I could, I just want to quote from him, and I'll try to bring out his rhetoric if I can. He said, "There is not a scholar in the Western world who teaches classics, who teaches history, or ancient Christianity that denies that Jesus existed. I've done my absolute best to fact check that claim, and I found that it is airtight." You can ask me in the Q&A what my sources are, how I found that out. There may be some that I and all the sources I checked couldn't find. But even if there are a handful out of the 6,000 plus full-time teaching scholars in these fields, maybe they're in the closet or something, we would still have 99.9% of the scholarly community, that's atheists and agnostics and Jews and Christians all over the spectrum, accepting these sources and all these facts I'm laying before you today. If you believe that we can ascertain facts from history when all we have is written documents, which is the vast majority of history, by the way, then you must accept Jesus' crucifixion in the early 30s and these 6 other historical facts that I'm about to lay before you. If you reject them, then you must reject just about everything from the ancient world with which we only have written documentation for. Fact number 2. Jesus' earliest followers, including Peter, James, and John, and other groups, believers and at least one unbeliever, at different times and places, believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. We know this from that early creed, 1 Corinthians 15. Let me quote it for you. "Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and he was raised again on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas," which means Peter, and then he appeared to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at the same time. Some have died, but some are still alive, and then he appeared to James, and then he appeared to all the apostles. That is over 512 eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus reported in this creed that we can know through the critical tools of history dating to within 2 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Pretty incredible, actually. The agnostic scholar Paula Friedrichsen says, "I know in their own terms what they saw as the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and when all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. In the cross-examination, I look forward to talking about what did they see? What did the 500 plus eyewitnesses, according to Paul, see? What did Peter see? Why was Peter willing to go to his death for this crucified Jesus? What did James see? Jesus' own brother. In fact, Josephus is the one who records his martyrdom. Fact number 3. Paul the Pharisee, who sought to destroy the church and followers of Jesus, something happened to him that transformed him into Paul the Apostle. Some of you would call him the second founder of Christianity. And the reason he gave for this transformation is, last of all, he appeared to me. He added that to the end of that creed. Last of all, Jesus appeared to me. What happened to the Apostle Paul? What did he see? Why was he willing to go to his death for what he saw? Fact number 4. There were 14 other messianic-type movements, very similar to Jesus' right around the first century. All of these movements had a charismatic leader who gathered disciples around them. Many of them were hailed as the Messiah or the King of the Jews. And these movements usually fought against Rome, and then the Romans would send Russell Crowe, Maximus out to crush them with their legions and crucify their leader. And then guess what happened to the movement after the leaders were killed? Yeah, it ended. Anyone who survived, they went out and got jobs. In fact, N.T. Wright says Jewish revolutionaries whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape arrest themselves had two options. Either give up the revolution or find another leader. Claiming that the original leader was alive again was simply not an option, unless, of course, he was. In this one instance, for some reason, very soon after Jesus' crucifixion, this Jewish movement, out of the 14, this Jewish movement exploded within the very city that Jesus was crucified in. How do we account for this? Why only in this case did these Jewish followers of this Messiah say he had risen from the dead? If Jesus stayed dead, what made them act? It's really hard to get your movement going when you're dead. Try it sometime. Fact number 5, the unique proclamation that this crucified Messiah had risen from the dead in the middle of history. No one expected the Messiah to rise from the dead, let alone a crucified Messiah. This two-stage resurrection is utterly novel within the first century Jewish context. Most Jews expected a general resurrection of the dead, according to Daniel 12, but no one expected an individual Messiah to rise from the dead and then history to continue on. Again, none of those other 14 movements said that. None of those other 14 movements said that their leader, after he was killed, had risen from the dead. Even if they had had visions or hallucinations of Jesus, because they really, really wanted him to be the Messiah, they would not have then concluded that he had bodily risen from the dead. They would have said he was exalted to the right hand of God or something like that. This wasn't a category for them. So what created this unique belief among the earliest Christians that their crucified Messiah had bodily risen from the dead? Fact number 6. This Jewish movement of followers of Jesus transformed 1,500-year-old traditions, Jewish traditions, such as the Passover became the Lord's Supper. The bread and the wine no longer is about Egypt. It's now about the body and blood of Jesus. No longer are they following the food laws. No longer are they holding circumcision to be a requirement. The Sabbath day of worship has now become the Lord's Day, which is Sunday, because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. These were unique badges for the Jewish community. What accounts for this transformation of 1,500-year-old Jewish traditions? Nothing? Did nothing do all this? Where there is much smoke, there must be a fire. Lastly, fact number 7. The unique proclamation from this Jewish movement that this crucified carpenter is Lord of the world. These early Christians claim he shared in the unique identity with Yahweh, the God of Israel. What accounts for such a radical claim about this crucified man named Jesus? No one expected the Messiah to be God. The earliest followers of Jesus prayed to him, they worshipped him, and proclaimed him as Lord of the world, and yet they remained strict monotheists. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why would they say this about a dead, crucified, clearly false Messiah? In fact, the ancient hymn I told you about, Philippians 2, makes this even more shocking. In this ancient hymn, it says that every knee will bow, every tongue will confess one day that this Jesus is Lord. And that's quoting an Old Testament verse. Not just any Old Testament verse, but an Old Testament verse from Isaiah 45, the most fiercely monotheistic verse in the entire Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh himself is saying, I am the only God. There is no God but me. I alone created the heavens and the earth, and one day every knee will bow before me, every tongue will swear allegiance to me. And now, these early Jewish followers of Jesus are saying, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess to him. How do we account for this Jewish movement in the first century claiming Jesus is one with the God of Israel and Lord of the world? Unless, of course, he was and is. If you were to ask the Apostle Paul, how did he know that Jesus is Lord? He might say something about the prophecies, his own experience. But the bedrock reason Paul would give would be what the earliest followers of Jesus said. This Jesus whom you crucified was raised from the dead, and we are all witnesses. The resurrection authenticated all of Jesus' divine claims, his miracles, his exorcisms, and his proclamation that the kingdom of God has come. Maybe after 2,000 years of hundreds of different failed naturalistic explanations to account for these historical facts, maybe tonight we will hear a better explanation than what the apostles themselves said. God raised this Jesus from the dead. And let me close with just a word on Jesus' transformation of nations and men and women in history, beginning in the Roman Empire up to this very day. If Jesus rose from the dead, if he is Lord of the world, then we would expect him to still be transforming nations and the lives of men and women all the way to this day, wouldn't we? And that's exactly what he has done. Within about 300 years, the cross went from the place of execution to the foreheads of emperors. Emperors of Rome started to be baptized and had the cross sign put on their foreheads. By the 4th century, the gods of Egypt and Greece and Rome that had been worshipped for thousands of years were essentially wiped off the face of the earth. And they haven't returned since except for bad superhero movies. Anyone still worship Ra or Zeus or Bacchus or Osiris? Thor? I mean, even the Hulk can beat up Thor. Jesus essentially said through his church to the gods of Egypt and Greece and Rome, come out of her and never enter her again. I love what John O'Mara, the scholar of patristics and early Christianity, says. The collapse of polytheism was in the end sudden, universal within the empire, and practically absolute. Truly the gods had lost, and Christ had won. Lastly, Jesus is still transforming the hearts and souls of men and women even to this day. Christ still rules over a spiritual empire that includes a third of the inhabitants of planet Earth. People all over the world are still experiencing this Jesus of Nazareth. Even right now as I speak, statistically, maybe someone is coming to Christ. Someone is praying the Lord's Prayer. Paul said everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And that is just as true now as it was in first century Rome. Think of all those who have transformed the world, who were first transformed by Christ. From Paul to Augustine to Aquinas to Dante to Milton to Teresa of Avila to Luther to Pascal to Wilberforce to Hannah More to Florence Nightingale to Dorothy Sayers to Tolkien to Lewis to Bonhoeffer to Martin Luther King Jr. and on and on. Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations, and this gospel that I preach will be preached to every nation on this planet. Here's a question. If you had to bet, would you say that Jesus' prophecy that his gospel will go to every nation on the planet, that it will eventually go there, or that it won't? I'm going to bet that it will. Let me just close with a testimony from a friend of mine. He's a renowned New Testament scholar from Australia named Michael Bird. He was raised by unbelieving parents and was an atheist until he encountered Christ in his graduate studies. He describes what happened this way. If anyone thinks they are assured in their unbelief, I was more committed. Born of unbelieving parents, never baptized or dedicated, on scholarly credentials, a PhD from a secular university, as to zeal mocking the church, as to ideological righteousness totally radicalized. But whatever intellectual superiority I thought I had over Christians, I now counted as sheer ignorance. Indeed, I count everything in my former life as a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing the historical Jesus, who is also the risen Lord. For his sake, I have given up trying to be a hipster atheist. I consider that old chestnut pure filth, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a CV that will gain me tenure at an Ivy League school, but knowing that I bound myself to Jesus, and where he is, there I also shall be. Jesus is Lord. Thank you.
I'm blue all over blue is what I'm feeling without you. The moon, the cheese, the sun.
Our second presenter, Dan Barker, is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and co-host of the National Free Thought radio show with his wife, Annie Lorraine Gaylor. Dan tells his personal story in the book Godless, how an evangelical preacher became one of America's leading atheists, forward by Richard Dawkins. His most recent book, with a forward by Daniel C. Dennett, is Life-Driven Purpose, How an Atheist Finds Meaning. A professional jazz pianist on the side, he and I discussed that last time, it was awesome. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Speaking to the topic, Jesus of Nazareth, Lord or Legend, please welcome Dan Barker.
Hello, Texas. And hello, Texas freethinkers who are and also you believers. I've done, as was said, more than 120 public debates like this, and they just get funner and funner. The first few were scary. But they're kind of like sporting events, aren't they? Like one side has, who's going to win. There's a certain excitement, especially when you care passionately about something. It reminds me of the story of the priest who took a rabbi to his first boxing match. And when the bell rang, one of the boxers made the sign of the cross. And the rabbi asked the priest, "What does that mean?" And the priest said, "Not a damn thing, you can't fight." Well, I have to tell you, Justin can fight. He's a good debater. He's a smart guy. He's very articulate, and I've come to enjoy his hospitality and his friendship, and the friendship of some of the others here. We are all in the same species. We all come from similar origins, so we're one big family. We don't have to have holy wars anymore over our differences of opinion. By the way, that debate in Oxford, by the way, John Lennox went first, and then I went second, so he got the order kind of back around a little bit. But you know my story. I used to be a preacher. I used to believe exactly what Justin is preaching, exactly what a lot of you believe. I dedicated my life to it. I lived by faith. I thought it was true. I accepted Christ as my Savior. I believed in the resurrection of Jesus, not only His power over death, but for a promise for eternal life. And I thought the Lord was coming soon. And I changed my mind. And for good reason. I tell the story in my book. Christianity is simply not true. Christianity does have some probability of historical truth to it. Obviously, we have documents, as Justin talked about. But our topic tonight is Jesus of Nazareth, Lord or Legend. Right after the bat here, right in the middle of the debate, in the title, we have legend. There could not have been a Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth did not even exist during the time of Jesus. The earliest occupation of the city of Nazareth was around 100 AD, maybe as early as the destruction of the temple around 70 AD. The phrase Jesus of Nazareth is an anachronism. It's a mistake that the later Christian writers didn't know they were making, probably confusing the sect of the Nazarenes with the later city of Nazareth. Jesus might have existed as a historical person. The historical existence of Jesus is not a deal breaker for me or for any other skeptic or non-Christian. But I think the probability of the existence of Jesus, while not zero, is still pretty low. And I think there are very good reasons for it. There is no external confirmation for the story contemporary with the supposed life of Jesus. There are stories about other self-proclaimed messiahs during the early 1st century. Justin talked about some of those. Philo and other writers wrote about Judas the Christ, Theudas the Christ, the Egyptian Jew Messiah, Apollonius of Tyre, and others, but nothing about Jesus contemporary with his life. The Gospels were written decades later, much like the stories of Robin Hood or Paul Bunyan were written decades later. Robin Hood might have existed, Paul Bunyan might have existed, but what's the probabilities of it? The lack of external confirmation lowers the probability. You're looking at historical method. The New Testament stories about Jesus are internally contradictory. For example, Matthew has Jesus born during the reign of King Herod, who died in 4 BC, but Luke tells us he was born when Quirinius became governor of Syria, which happened in 6 AD. So Jesus was 9 years old when he was born, apparently. There are many more mistakes in the Gospels, including the contradictory genealogies given by Matthew and Luke. The resurrection of Jesus, and I told John Lennox this in Oxford, is the worst example you could give for historical proof of the Bible, because, as Justin admits, it's given at least 5 times in the New Testament, and they are hopelessly contradictory. You can see my Easter challenge, and I have copies of it here if you like, for a list of at least 17 irreconcilable discrepancies in the resurrection accounts. These internal contradictions within the story lower the probability. They don't disprove it, but they lower the probability of historicity and raise the probability of legend. By the way, the appearances that Justin refers to, that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 15, were appearances. That Greek word is ophi, from the Greek word orao, which means to, like a vision, a visionary experience. Paul never claimed to have met Jesus personally. He didn't shake his hands. He said, when God revealed himself to me, his experience on the road to Damascus, which he claimed as one of the appearances of Jesus, was really a sort of a spiritual thing, kind of like when grandma dies and goes to heaven, you think, well, I still talk to grandma. He did not ever claim to have met the bodily resurrected Jesus. And none of those appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, by the way, written a quarter of a century after the fact to people who lived 1,500 miles away, who had no way to check who were these 500 witnesses or so. They were just names. And Paul even gives away the date by saying, he appeared lastly unto me. That word appeared did not mean physically mean. What if I said, I wanted to see if Justin was home? So I went up to his front door and knocked on the door, and the door opened, and Justin appeared to me. That's like a haunted house, right? Like a spook story. They were having visionary experiences of their Lord who had died. Nothing in those accounts talks about an actual physical meeting with a resurrected body. Then there's the silence of Paul. Paul wrote his epistle, as we know, before the Gospels. And Paul, who never met Jesus personally, doesn't mention a single miracle or saying of Jesus in all of his epistles, except for that Last Supper formula, which was common currency. Paul sometimes even contradicted what Jesus supposedly said. If Jesus had really existed, Paul should have quoted him extensively. He did not. Have you ever noticed that when you read the Bible? This lowers the probability, doesn't bring it to zero. There are also many pagan parallels to the Jesus story that predate the Gospels, like the divine births of Hercules and Theagenes and Alexander the Great and Caesar Augustus and Apollonius of Tyana and Pythagoras and so on. Stories about God-men who came down to earth. They performed miracles. They were persecuted by the government. They were executed. Some of them even raised to the dead, Dionysus, and some of them had empty tombs like Dionysus. Some of them ascended into heaven. The Jesus story, although not exactly the same as all of them, it appears to be cut from the same fabric as other pagan myths and legends that were floating around that region in the time of history. That doesn't disprove the story, but it lowers the probability that it's an actual unique historical event. Some early Christians even noticed these commonalities. Justin Martyr wrote to the pagans, when we say that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was produced without sexual union, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended to heaven, we Christians propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem to be the sons of Jupiter. He may have been exaggerating the similarities a bit, but if an early Christian said that Christianity is nothing different from paganism, who are we to disagree? This lowers the probability. Perhaps the strongest argument, though, is the fact that the New Testament itself reveals, and Justin even uses words, reveals the footprints of legend, legendary growth. If we take the accounts of the resurrection, for example, place them in the order in which they were written in history, we can see before our eyes a growing curve of legendary embellishment as the years pass. Paul's account, around 50 to 55, has no extraordinary event, especially when you consider the appearance was a visionary appearance, which is not extraordinary at all. It happens all the time. It happens right now. That's a normal event. Mark, around the year 70, has maybe one extraordinary event, the man dressed in white at the tomb. Matthew, 10 years later, has 4. Luke, around the year 85, has 5 extraordinary events. You can see it growing. You can see the footprint of how it exaggerates over time. The extra-canonical Gospel of Peter, we're not sure where that's dated, but it has 6 extraordinary events in the story. And John, writing at least 60 years after the story, maybe 70, has more than 6 extraordinary events, including many other signs which are not written in this book. This clear expansion of miraculous events as time passes betrays the handiwork of legend. We see that in other myths and legends throughout history. This doesn't disprove the story, but it lowers the probability of the historicity of the Jesus stories. Even if the story is not a legend, even if the miracle stories were reliably reported, this would not prove the existence of a God, nor would it mean that Jesus is our Lord. There's nothing Jesus said or did that causes me to respect or admire, much less worship him as a moral leader. I would be embarrassed to call Jesus my Lord. Let me get some water. My next book, which is going to be published by Sterling Publishing, is called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. It's based on that famous sentence in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And Richard asked me to write this book for him, so it's just coming out in a few months. That famous sentence that Richard Dawkins wrote: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Those are not just empty words. I have 1,500 passages from the Old Testament documenting every single one of those adjectives in great detail. You can read the book when it comes out. Christians, however, believe that God should not be judged by the Old Testament. Perhaps the God of the Israelites was fierce and angry, but gentle Jesus, the humble and loving Son of God, he fulfilled the old law and made everything new. It's called the New Testament, right? But why do they think that? According to the Gospels, Jesus was the God of the Old Testament. He said, the Father and I are one. The Father's in me and I'm in the Father. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So every single attribute Richard Dawkins used to describe the fictional God of the Old Testament applies equally to Jesus. Whenever Jesus quoted his Father, he pulled directly from the Old Testament. He told his disciples that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. When a lawyer asked Jesus, what was God's greatest commandment? Jesus' reply came from the Old Testament. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That sounds kind of lofty, doesn't it? But if we look at the actual Old Testament source of Jesus' quote, we realize that those are genocidal words of the Old Testament war god. They are part of that angry, curse-hurling commandment of the ethnic cleanser God delivered by Moses in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. Let me read it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, a land with fine cities that you didn't build, houses with goods that you didn't fill, cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. In other words, they invaded and stole them from the inhabitants. Do not follow other gods, any of the gods of the people who are all around you, because the Lord your God is a jealous God. The anger of the Lord your God would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth. Doesn't sound much like love, doesn't it? But these loving words that Jesus quoted were spoken during that war rally as the Israelites were looking forward to their bloody invasion of the so-called Promised Land. God was saying, steal their land, but don't love their gods. Love me, and me alone. He was a very jealous, kind of a jealous husband. If Jesus was the God of the Old Testament, as he claimed, then he indeed was a jealous, angry, and genocidal Lord. When Jesus said to the devil, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, in Matthew 4, he was quoting the Old Testament incompletely and out of context. If we look at the actual source of Jesus' quote, which is a continuation of that war rally, we see that he was again calling himself that angry, genocidal God of the Old Testament. Here's the quote. Lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from the face of the earth, ye shall not tempt the Lord your God, as ye tempted him in Massah. ye shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, that thou mightest go in and possess the good land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, to cast out all thine enemies from before thee, as the Lord hath spoken. There you have it. Jesus endorsed aggressive invasion and bloodshed. Many Christians think Jesus was a man of peace, but Matthew, quoting the Old Testament, said the opposite. Do not think that I have come to bring peace. Jesus said the opposite in Matthew. Do not think that I have come to bring peace. I have not come to bring peace on the earth, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Foes will be members of their own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Jesus, like his war god father, thought the violence of the sword was more important than family values. Actually, he was quoting the prophet Micah, who said, for the son treats the father with contempt, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. Jesus preached hatred of your family, like a cult leader. The New Testament, it's supposed to be this New Testament, right? But it is one colossal missed opportunity. This would have been a perfect place for the Word of God to mature into a real moral tale. The old replaced by the new. Anger and jealousy replaced by kindness and understanding. But instead of reforming the cruel policies of the past, Jesus reconfirmed them. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. That's disappointing. Instead of a newer, kinder testament, we get the same taxi with a different driver. Jesus was like a politician who gets elected promising sweeping reform, but immediately takes up with the same old corruption. In that passage, Jesus paints a picture of paradise as a perpetual pecking order of political favoritism, the least and the greatest. Jesus could have said, I apologize for the war crimes of my father. He should not have exterminated entire towns or drowned 20 million people, including innocent infants and fetuses. But no, he quoted his murderous father with glowing approval. He tells a parable in which he approves of a thieving king who says, but as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to be king, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence. He tells that story approvingly. Why didn't Jesus point out that vindictive, pestilential genocide is a high crime against humanity? Wasn't he supposed to be better than that? He should have felt horrible about his father's inhumane treatment of animals, but had no qualms about causing a herd of swine to drown in the sea. Why didn't Jesus condemn his father's scorching pyromania? In the Old Testament, we see burning, scorching all over the place. Instead, he tells us that non-believers should be incinerated. Here's Jesus. Whoever does not invite in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. The burning of witches and heretics and atheists throughout the shameful history of Christianity was based on that one cruel verse spoken by the loving Jesus. Like his father, Jesus was obsessed with fire. One of the actually new teachings in the New Testament was his promotion of scorching torment in the afterlife. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the kind and gentle Jesus. Then he will say to those at his left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Instead of putting out his Father's fire, Jesus threw gas on it. It might seem good that the New Testament introduced the idea of eternal life, but that's negated by the idea of eternal punishment. Jesus could have said, you should be kind to others because human beings deserve to be treated with fairness and equality. Instead, he said, turn or burn. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go into hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched, just like his pyromaniacal father. He likes to play with fire. Thanks to Jesus, the world is now blessed with the horror of hell. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry my father was so angry," Jesus looked at his critics with anger. He attacked merchants with the whip. He indignantly and irrationally cursed a fig tree for being fruitless, out of season while he was hungry. He was indeed his father's son. Instead of wincing at the overweening megalomania of the Lord jealous of the Old Testament, the humble Jesus said, "I am greater than the temple. I am greater than Jonah. I am greater than Solomon." He appeared to suffer from a warlord paranoia when he said, "Whoever's not with me is against me." Jesus could have said, "It was horribly sexist and cruel for my father to threaten to rape non-believing women, as he did in Jeremiah 13. He could have made great strides in women's equality by condemning his father's misogynistic mindset, but he chose to maintain the status quo. His inner circle of 12 disciples were all male. No women were invited to the Last Supper. Women were on the sidelines of the story, but never in positions of leadership. The women who discovered the empty tomb were instructed to tell the male disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. Women were not invited. But perhaps the greatest missed opportunity of the New Testament was the chance to outlaw slavery. Jesus could have said, "I humbly apologize. My father was stuck in a primitive patriarchal mindset where the possession and abuse of human beings was economically prudent, but I have come to abolish that cruel institution and emancipate all captive people." He could have said that. He could have abolished slavery more than 1,800 years before the American Civil War, saving rivers of blood and oceans of misery. Instead, Jesus talks about human bondage as if it were the most natural order, incorporating it into his parables as if he or his writers were simply reflecting the culture of their time. I suppose we should award Jesus a few points of compassion for pointing out in Luke 12, verse 47 and 48, that there are some slaves who should not be beaten as hard as others. I used to preach that Jesus was a man of family value, but he never used the word family. He never got married. He never had children. Like a cult leader, he preached family hatred. "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yea, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." You have to hate. That Greek word there is miseo, or the word misogyny, misanthropy. When one of his disciples wanted time off to go to his father's funeral, Jesus rebuked him. "Follow me, let the dead bury their own dead." If Jesus is Lord, forget about family values. Jesus, I never preached a sermon like this, but did you know that Jesus encouraged castration? In Matthew 19, here's Jesus. "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." Some believers, including the early church father Origen, have interpreted this gruesome verse literally and have taken a knife to themselves. There were an entire order of castrati who thought that Jesus was telling them to cut themselves. But even if you interpret it just metaphorically, the advice is in appalling taste. Jesus clearly held the family in the lowest regard. Jesus could have taken the opportunity to establish programs to help the poor, but he was more interested in attracting attention to himself. Rather than sell expensive ointment to feed the needy, Jesus lavished it on his own feet. He said, "You always have the poor with you. You can show kindness to them whenever you wish. You will not always have me." That's not a very empathetic or socially conscious remark. Yes, the New Testament is a bit better than the Old. Jesus healed some people, but they ended up dying. It was all to show his power, really. What moral advice did Jesus give? Actually, as a moral teacher, what moral advice did he really give us? And I'm only 2 more minutes. Are you signaling me here? No. Oh, okay, good. There's no big cane to... What moral advice? Think about it. Jesus is a great moral teacher, right? I've even heard atheists say Jesus is a great moral teacher. Don't save money. Don't plan for the future. Don't become wealthy. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor. He said to do that, but he actually didn't institute any programs or advise that. Don't work to obtain food. Don't have sexual urges. Marrying a divorced woman is adultery. Are there anybody here who's married to a woman who's been divorced? If you are committing adultery, according to Jesus. Make people want to persecute you. Let everyone know, in Matthew 5, you are better than the rest. Take money from those who have no savings and give it to rich investors. If somebody steals from you, don't try to get it back. If someone hits you, invite them to do it again. If you lose the lawsuit, Jesus said, pay more than the judgment. If anyone asks you for anything, give it to them without question. Without question. If anyone, there's no qualifications there. Is this good advice? Is this the kind of advice Christians teach to their children? The good advice Jesus did give is unremarkable. Nothing we would not expect from any other religious leader or moral philosopher. The so-called golden rule had been said many times before by earlier religious leaders, and better than Jesus said it. When Jesus said that the second commandment was to love your neighbor as yourself, that kind of sounds compassionate, doesn't it? Love your neighbor as yourself. But that only works if you happen to be the neighbor. Looking at the Old Testament source of his quote that he was quoting, we learn what neighbor actually meant. Here it is in Leviticus 19. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Neighbor meant your own kin, any of your people. The Israelites were merely commanded to love other Israelites. That love did not extend to anyone who worshipped another god, certainly not to any neighboring tribes or nations who were killed or turned into slaves. Loving your neighbor is not a new idea. All groups of people love those of their own kind. Surprise, surprise. The Beatitudes in Matthew 5, they do acknowledge some good ideas, such as blessed are the peacemakers. All religions talk about peace. What religion do you know that doesn't talk about peace? But notice that the Beatitudes are all conditioned on reward and punishment, such as so that you will inherit the earth. They're not based on what we would call moral principles. None of the Beatitudes say you should act kindly toward others because human beings have an inherent right to be treated with fairness and dignity regardless of whether you get anything out of it. The Beatitudes are aimed at being good believers, not good human beings. Why does anyone think Jesus deserves our admiration? I even know some atheists who think he was a great ethical thinker, but where do they find that in the Bible? A few of his teachings were passable, some were ambiguous, and many were appalling. Any one of us in this room could have come up with a better system of human conduct. Since Jesus claimed to be the brutal God of the Old Testament, morally, the Christian faith rests on sinking sand. The best we can call Jesus is legend. Justin might want to call him Lord, but I cannot do that. I'm better than that, and so are you.
All I wanted wasn't meant to be. All I wanted didn't happen to me.
We will start with Dr. Bass, questioning Mr. Barker. 10 minutes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right, Dan, thanks again for coming. Start off with a very important question. If ISIS takes over America, who do you think they'll kill first, the Christians or the atheists?
Is this mic on?
Hang on. It's on.
One, two, three. Okay. If ISIS takes over America, this is hypothetical, right?
Very serious question. Very important.
Assuming they're going to kill anybody when they get here, I think I think they'll kill the first non-Muslim they see. And since there's more self-proclaimed Christians in America, and it might be a little harder to find the atheists, it's probably more likely that a Christian would be the first one to be killed, but were both equally guilty, I think, in their minds of rejecting their deity.
I was trying to unite us a little bit there. We're kind of united if ISIS took over.
Well, in their minds, we both have horns, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
So, Dan, do you agree with me that there is no pagan, no other religion parallel in the ancient world contemporary to Jesus at all of someone dying and forgiving and praying for their enemies? Do you agree that that's unique to Jesus?
Well, the idea of dying for your enemy, I don't think we have found any ancient religions or documents that predate Christianity.
So that is unique to Jesus.
But every religion has uniquenesses in it.
Right, but that's
So-
a unique one to Jesus.
Yeah, but it's not important. How many Christians die for their enemies? I mean, that's not an important concept, right? I mean, is that how you live your life?
But did things like that not inspire Gandhi and Martin Luther King and things like that? That didn't inspire them to be nonviolent?
I don't know if that
and
inspired them. I mean, I know atheists who feel inspired to risk their lives for what they believe in, so I think it's a natural human thing. This idea of dying for your enemy seems kind of pointless. I mean, if a maniac is attacking your family, are you going to give your life for that maniac, or are you going to protect your family? What's the point of dying for your enemy? If your enemy is doing something immoral, you need to protect your family. So it seems like a kind of a silly thing to be unique about
But we
in a
established
religion.
that it's a unique thing to love your enemies and pray for them while they're killing you. I mean, that's unique.
No,
to
that's
Jesus.
not unique. To love them is not unique. There were Greek philosophers and there were Babylonian ideas of actually loving and caring and treating
Okay,
your
we can
enemies.
move on, but you agree that that's unique. It's
The
unique.
dying for
Exactly. That's unique.
but all religions have things in them that you could say are unique, so a big deal.
If Jesus, let's say hypothetically Jesus did bodily rise from the dead, okay, how would you have seen the last 2,000 years, the Western world, different? How would you have seen things being different if Jesus had risen from the dead?
If he had not,
No, if he had. Hypothetically, if he did rise from the dead, would he have influenced the world more? Would he have transformed more nations? What would he have done different? What would be
well,
different?
everything that happens in history has some ripple effect, so there would be some effect, right? Scientists would want to investigate. I mean, I would be fascinated if somebody rose from the dead. That wouldn't prove there's a God. That would prove that somebody rose from the dead. That would be pretty interesting,
Yeah,
right?
but if you agree Jesus rose from the dead, I mean, I'll be pleased with that.
Yeah, but there's other people who believe the same thing, so,
Yeah.
Lazarus supposedly rose from the dead. Did his resurrection transform the world because somebody believed that this guy rose from the dead?
The debate is whether Jesus is Lord or legend. If he rose from the dead, I think it's more on my side than yours.
It would be pretty impressive, yes.
Okay, good.
If that happened, of course.
Okay.
I mean, it would be an extraordinary event that, wow, I mean, we atheists don't have our heads stuck in the sand, like, nope, couldn't have happened. If it happened, and by the way, I don't have an a priori bias against miracles. I just think, like you do, that in the historical method, miracle reports make a story less probable.
Okay. Can you tell me another event in the ancient world where we have over 512 eyewitnesses reported, and all scholars agree that that's an accurate report, that 512 plus witnessed the event?
Not all scholars agree that 512 plus witnessed the
No,
event.
that Paul is telling the truth, that he believed that these people witnessed the event. That is what
The scholars agree that Paul, who wrote that, believed that happened.
True.
But that doesn't mean we have the testimony of those 500. Convenient.
Right, but is there any other evidence at all in the ancient world of someone even believing that they had over 500 witnesses? I mean, if Josephus said, "I have 500 plus witnesses that saw this event," scholars would, they would just drool over that. That would be huge.
But they don't have witnesses. They just have Paul giving us a number.
Right.
There's no names. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier,
Well, why does he say some of them are alive?
well, that shows that some time passed. Paul believed it. I'm with you.
But he's writing to the Corinthians 25 years later, and in fact, that parallels Josephus very well. And Josephus actually says almost identical language. Many people can affirm the things I'm talking about. Some are still alive, some have died. Paul's making the same claim. Even Rudolf Bultmann, who was extremely liberal, demythologized the entire New Testament, but he still believed Paul here is betraying himself. He's trying to use historical evidence here. So Paul would lose his credibility as an apostle with the Corinthians if those 500 people, if some of them couldn't be interviewed by the Corinthians.
They couldn't be. The Corinthians lived by land 1,500 miles away. Most of them had not even been born. Life expectancy in first century Rome was about 40.
Did Peter visit Corinth?
In any event,
Did James
who were
visit
those
Corinth?
500 people? There's
But
no names.
did Peter and James visit Corinth? And they were from Jerusalem, correct?
So they got there. They went.
Okay.
They might have gone
so
by
they
sea,
made it.
which is
Somehow they
shorter.
made it. So people from Corinth could maybe take a Disneyland trip, not to Disneyland, but they could go visit the people who interviewed people who saw the risen Jesus, correct?
Well, we don't have any evidence that happened.
Well, that is the evidence.
But,
Paul says some of them are still alive. You can interview them. That's the.
but we
because you
don't
can
have
parallel it
any
with
evidence
Josephus.
that anybody went from Corinth back to the Palestine and interviewed those people. It was just a creedal statement that he made.
Paul is saying that you can, because his credibility is on the line. That's a big issue with him with his early letters, as
Exactly,
you know.
and he wasn't credible. I mean, we can agree that the historians agree.
He wasn't credible. What evidence of Paul shows that he's not credible?
Well, for example, he says that he met the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, right? Sometime after Jesus supposedly died and ascended to
Where
heaven.
does Paul say that he met the resurrected?
On the road to Damascus.
Where does he say that? That's in Acts. Paul says, I saw the risen Jesus, correct?
No, he didn't say he saw the risen.
He
no.
didn't say that? 1 Corinthians 9:1 doesn't say,
Paul
I saw
said,
the risen
flesh
Jesus.
and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
Paul
wrote in
Where's our
fifth-
Bibles? We're got two pastors up here. We need Bibles.
Paul
That's crazy.
wrote in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared to him. And that word appeared, as I pointed
have it
out
right here.
before. And look it up in the Greek. The word there is ophthi.
Yeah, where's my Greek New Testament? Goodness gracious.
Do you remember the story of the Transfiguration?
Dan, 1 Corinthians 9:1 says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord Jesus our Lord?
Yeah, and that word seen, what translation is that?
That's the NIV, but that's the same thing in
Okay,
the
well
Greek.
then-
I read the Greek. I
But
mean, I just
the
don't have my
Greek does
New
not
Testament.
say seen. It says
Yeah, it's
appeared.
It's from horao.
The NIV is not a very good translation. But
Okay,
the
but it's from horao. I know the Greek word.
orao is for the word that they use for vision. Orama is a vision,
No,
right?
no, it can mean, no, it's used multiple times in the New Testament for actual physical appearances.
Okay, let me give you an example then. That exact word, ophthi, from the Greek word orao, was used in the Transfiguration story. You know, when they went up and they supposedly saw Moses and Elijah, it said they appeared. They used the exact same word to Peter and James. And so are we to suppose that the physical bodies of Moses and Elijah, are we supposed to look for the empty graves of Moses and Elijah? Because that word was used as an appearance, obviously a spiritual
Dan, what happened
visionary.
to Elijah, according to the Old Testament? Was he buried?
No, well, Moses had a grave.
No, but Elijah wasn't
so
buried.
the
correct?
the
So why
Bible
would they
gives
look
us-
for, why would they look for Elijah's grave when he wasn't buried?
Well, whatever.
So he was a physical body.
But there was no physical body that came down on the Mount of Transfiguration. No one
Why?
thinks.
Why? That's exactly what Luke and them are presenting.
Are
and
you
that's why
kidding
often-
me?
So you're shooting
The
yourself in
word
the
they
foot.
used there, in fact, if you look at the context of that
Was
verse.
Elijah dead or buried ever? According to you don't think Luke believed the Old Testament that Elijah was carried up into heaven
Well,
and did not die?
if Elijah existed, he died.
Well,
It
of
was
course
the
you
story.
believe that, but I'm saying, what did Luke believe? And he's using the Greek word ophthi.
What about
And-
Moses then?
Okay,
Moses
the same-
died
Look at
and went into the grave.
Look at pseudepigraphical literature. They're the same kind of things because in Deuteronomy it had this mysterious statement that God buried Moses, but there was some kind of unique thing about his body. And so, yes, ophthi can be used all throughout the LXX, all throughout the Septuagint, all throughout the New Testament. It's used many times for an actual physical
So the
appearance.
physical
So
body-
you can't do it just on that one.
So let's get this straight. The physical body of Moses, thousands of years early, is somehow physically inhabiting some realm up there. Like with Paul, it was a voice in the cloud that came down, right? Somehow, did he need to shave? Did he have to go to the bathroom? He had a physical body up in the clouds?
If God
Is that what you're saying?
If God exists, you really having a problem with this?
I do. If you use the word body, and even Paul said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
He means mortality. He means.
He means flesh and blood.
Yeah, he means flesh and blood, but that's a common idiom.
So that he
all
did not
throughout.
see a flesh and blood. He had a visionary
No.
experience.
So tell me this: in the ancient world, what is the unanimous testimony of Pharisees? What did Pharisees believe about the resurrection of the dead? They believed that it was bodily, correct?
Yeah, they believed that, but
Pharisees
the word
believed that it was bodily. Is Paul a Pharisee? Is Paul a Pharisee?
Paul would have believed that, but the point is that
so Paul believed that there was a physical resurrection at the end of the world, right?
He could have
People
said-
would be physically resurrected, correct?
he could have said, yeah, he believed that, but he could have said in 1 Corinthians 15
he parallels that with
I
Jesus'
saw
resurrection.
Jesus.
Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of the general resurrection. And the general resurrection for Paul is undeniably a physical resurrection. I can show you passage after passage where
No.
he says the body
I'm sorry.
of
No.
our body. Yeah, that's exactly what he
In
says.
fact, in Galatians, Paul is very clear to say That when God chose to reveal his Son in me, it wasn't an external physical body experience. It was an internal.
So if someone saw Jesus physically stand before them, there wouldn't be an inner experience.
You wouldn't say that Jesus appeared in me. You would say, I went up and shook hands with him and I patted him on the back.
I read you 1 Corinthians 9:1. I've seen the risen Jesus.
But that's a bad translation. You know the NIV is a bad translation.
No, you can't just say the NIV is a bad translation.
Look at other English translations.
The Greek says,
appeared.
I have seen the Lord Jesus. That's exactly what it says. And that word is used many times for physical appearance in the
No, it doesn't say
Septuagint.
seen.
Yes.
Ophthi means appeared unto. Is that part? Ophthi is a past participle. He appeared unto me like a ghost. A ghost appears to you. In fact, if you look at the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus all through the New Testament, you see he vanishes out of thin air and he's not recognized. The people didn't know who he was. He only had about 6 appearances during those times. It's not the way you talk about an actual bodily person coming back to life. It's what you talk about a ghost.
General physical resurrection of all believers. You agree with that. And he parallels Jesus' resurrection. That's the grounding for the general resurrection of all believers one day. And so Jesus' resurrection would be bodily for Paul, if the resurrection of all believers is bodily for Paul.
So the body of Jesus was hanging up in a cloud for 22 years?
Well, just because you can't understand other realms that God has created doesn't mean you can't deny what the text clearly says.
But I need to understand it if
Last
it's going to make any
question.
sense.
I missed my cloud.
I see a vision in the cloud. Look
Yeah,
at that.
you like that? You like
What do you
that?
Woo! I see Charles Darwin. Look. He appeared unto me.
Okay, that took 13 minutes. We're going to give Dan Barker 13 minutes as well.
No, we don't want. I want to go to questions really quick here. So let's.
Do you
try to
really?
Yeah.
Let's get it.
So.
All right.
Why don't we just go? I could ask some questions, but let's go to questions now so the audience can be more involved, and maybe I'll ask
If
some of my
you have a
questions.
question for Dr. Bass, line up on that microphone over there. If you have a question for Dan Barker, line up on this microphone over here.
Where is my Greek New Testament? Unbelievable.
I have many questions submitted online. We will respectfully rotate. Dr. Bass, Dr. Barker, questions online.
I'm not a doctor, sorry. I play one though on debates.
Tonight, you have an honorary doctorate. How's that?
All right.
If you've been here before, you know the drill. So I'm gonna explain it very quickly. Your question should be 2 minutes.
Or less.
Timex works the same on the wrist of a Christian or a non-Christian. 120 seconds. Give me a break. Ask your question quickly. We will rotate and continue. Question from the floor from Dr. Zach for Dr. Bass. Go ahead.
Hi, testing. Hi, Justin. One of the points that you made early on was with regard to the sort of the overwhelming totality of the scholars in agreement that Jesus is historical. And you added a couple of qualifiers. You said that no teaching scholar in a university today believes that.
Yes.
Should we also assume that no scholar anywhere at any time has also believed that?
Say that again?
Should
No other teaching scholar?
No,
I'm saying a teaching scholar alive today. is what I'm
Right,
saying.
so if we take the qualifiers away, is that also true? Are there no scholars anywhere at any time that have ever...
Teaching, I would say there's probably been a handful in the last 300 years post-Enlightenment research on Jesus. About a handful.
And what can you tell us about those scholars?
Well, there was a Roman Catholic scholar that I think he died or he's retired that claimed this, that actually said that Jesus didn't exist. I think he got excommunicated as a result. But him and there was a few others, but I haven't. As far as people alive today, teaching today, full-time, 6,000 plus, according to the estimates of Ehrman, not one. Now, like I said, there could be some that I couldn't find, but as far as the sources, according to Bart Ehrman, according to Gary Habermas, according to many people that I checked with, according to the summaries and the consensus of many historical Jesus books that I referenced, all of them say, Jesus Seminar, overwhelming majority of the Jesus Seminar agrees that Jesus existed.
Okay, thank you.
Well, can I respond very quickly? On the question of the resurrection of Jesus, though, it's a different percentage. I have a list here of at
Oh, of
least...
course, it'd be divided between believer and unbeliever.
I have 78 scholars here who teach actively in universities with PhDs or equivalent in the biblical languages in the field, who say not that Jesus didn't exist, but that the resurrection of Jesus did not happen. So if you want a list, I'll hand it out to anybody who
Oh,
wants
yeah,
it.
it would be
By the
split
way,
between believer and believer.
I don't think we should argue by authority, by the way, or by consensus. I think we should argue from the evidence and the facts themselves. But since
Well,
you brought up...
there's good reason they believe. There's good reason they believe. We could talk about those reasons if you want to. But when all of them believe something, I think that's something to look at.
Question, Dr. Barker.
Dr. Barker, thank you for coming tonight from Wisconsin.
It's just Mr. Barker, though.
Mr. Barker,
Yeah.
Dr. Barker. Yeah, well, I'm honoring the honorary degree.
Captain Jazz Barker. How's
Captain
that?
Jazz. All right. Thank you for coming. Three questions in one, kind of. Is the argument against the Old Testament in regards to it being true and offensive, or is the argument simply that it's false and Jesus was quoting from fiction?
Well, it's both. The Old Testament is fictional, and so is the New Testament, mainly. It's like historical fiction. It'd be like the novels of James Michener. Have some history in them, but the story itself is a fiction. The Old Testament God is a fictional God. He started out polytheistic or henotheistic and became monotheistic. And so it's both a fictional argument and a moral argument. Even if he did exist, we ought not to admire such a monster.
Okay, thank you.
Question submitted online for Dan from Jonathan Hall. Do you find Richard Carrier's usage of Bayesian probability to be a coherent, reasonable application to the historic Jesus of Nazareth? If yes, please explain. If not, what methodology would you employ alternatively?
Yes, I do think Bayesian theory has merit. And I have Richard Carrier's book, and he's a friend of mine. But even he will admit that the numbers you pick to plug into that equation are somewhat subjective. And every historian has to do that. When a historian says, for example, it is highly likely, what do they mean? 70%? 90%? How do you pick the exact numbers? So while I agree with Richard Carrier in principle that Bayesian theorem is a good way to do history because it has all sorts of checks and balances within it, and it's open to adjustment. So if he thinks it's 28% likely that Jesus didn't exist, I don't know exactly how it comes out to 28, but he's open to going up to 40 or maybe 50 or maybe 60. That's the beauty of it, is that as new information comes along, that the equation of Bayesian theorem can adjust as we learn. We're not locked into some kind of a dogmatic position.
I think the bias of this is shown very clearly, especially when Richard Carrier does his Bayesian analysis of the existence of Jesus. He comes to about 28-30%. Richard Swinburne did an analysis of the resurrection of Jesus, and he said it was 97% likely. So
Yeah.
I would go more with the strict historical tools of the historical method that I
Well,
laid
at
out.
least Richard's a historian, and Swinburne, whom I've debated before, is a philosopher. But so it was probably somewhere more in the middle of those two extremes, you would say. It's not 100% or 0.
I don't know if it's the most trustworthy.
Question submitted online for Dan. Dan, do you understand the word neighbor in the Old Testament seems contrary to the countless references in the Old Testament where the Lord instructs Israel to care for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner? Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 10, verse 18, 19 are a couple of examples. The story of Ruth and Boaz is an example. The care for the foreigner in the Old Testament seems outside the definition of the neighbor or kin that you've laid out. Would you respond to this?
Okay, well, two things to say. First of all, going back to the exact Old Testament source that Jesus was quoting when he said, love your neighbor as yourself, when you look at that particular context, you see that it was directly attributed to your own Israelite neighbors. The context of Jesus' quote was your own neighbors, love your neighbor. And it is true that in the Old Testament, foreign people who lived within the Promised Land could be treated differently from the neighboring tribes. So the neighboring villages around, there's villages that are close off and villages that are far off. The way to have peace, by the way, with the villages that are next to the Promised Land was when you approach a village, it says in Deuteronomy, offer it terms of peace, that's the word shalom, And if it doesn't accept your terms of peace, then you should either turn them into slaves, into forced labor, or kill them. That's how you have peace on earth, is by either enslaving them or killing them. That's what the Old Testament says about your neighboring tribes. There was no love to the neighboring tribes and villages around. God was jealous. He considered them all as kind of potential rivals to his sweetheart, attracting them away.
Since we're talking about Jesus tonight, Jesus made clear, as I said in the parable of the Good Samaritan, what neighbor meant. And if he is the God of Israel, he made clear that a neighbor is anyone and everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity. Everyone should be loved with the full extent of love. That's exactly what he argued in the Good Samaritan, and that's why it was so shocking for the time.
So then he disagreed with his father. That's good to know.
No, he didn't disagree.
Question for Dr. Bass.
Justin, enjoyed the debate. Dan, it's really nice for you to finally see you here. I've read your books, and especially your latest book. It was really enjoyable. Justin, you're familiar with the P, Perseverance of the Saints, and the tulip, right? I don't know if you're a Calvinist or not. And you're familiar with Romans 9, he that, laid down his life, surely he'll keep you as a Christian. Jesus and John saying, he who I've chosen I'll no way cast out. Seems it's a pretty secure, locked up thing.
Yeah.
Well, right here we have Exhibit A, Dan Barker, who said from his books that if anybody was a Christian, I was.
Right.
And from what he said, that he went down to Mexico to convert Catholics. So how hardcore a Christian do you have to be to know that Catholics aren't Christians, that they need to be converted? And that
I disagree with that, but yeah.
And yeah, of course, I think Dan would too, at the time. But he went in with a van doing a preaching ministry, which I guess, Dan, you made very little money at. I think, like you said, you were a very committed Christian. My question to you, Justin, is, was Dan Barker ever a Christian?
Well, I can't say, I don't think I can actually answer that. But I'll say theologically what I think the New Testament teaches. I think if someone is saved, they will be preserved. I think that is the promise of God. So if Dan Barker received the Spirit of God when he trusted in Christ, which he claimed he did, we're going to see him come back to the Lord. Maybe tonight. But Dan will come back to the Lord if he was saved. If Dan dies a outspoken atheist, rejecting Christ, rejecting God, saying the kind of stuff he said tonight, then he never really was saved. That's if the New Testament is true. That's what the New Testament teaches.
Go ahead, Dan.
If I was not a true Christian, then nobody is. How dare you judge when the Bible says not to judge? The Bible says you shall know them by their fruits.
Dan, we should all reject...
I haven't finished my question, Justin. The Bible says you shall know them by their fruits, not by what they say. My life exhibited the fruits of the Spirit. People are in the ministry today as a result of my ministry. People were saved and born again. I risked my life. I risked my health. I went into the hospital, traveling and serving for Jesus, loving it, feeling it, getting the goosebumps, seeing what I was convinced were answers to prayer. I loved it. I believe it at least as much as you, if not more. And I reject it on good reasons.
Well, then maybe you're going to come back to the faith.
Unless Jesus changes his mind about some of his teachings, there's no way I'm going to go back and pretend to love such a monster. No way in hell would I ever do that. Unless you change your opinion about what he actually teaches and believes. It is beneath our dignity as moral human beings to call him a Lord.
No.
Question for Dan from Blake.
That's what we were created for.
Hey, Dad, over here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. First off, thank you so much for coming out here. I know we all enjoy hearing you. As you were speaking, I'm sort of amidst a group of Christians over here. We're kind of giving each other sort of strange looks during your opening statement, having a hard time figuring out how it relates to the debate topic. So I wanted to figure out more explicitly how it relates to the topic, because it kind of feels like you were throwing out red meat to the crowd here, but it didn't really engage in the debate. But what I did want, there was one part that we agreed that you did say that is relevant to the debate. At the beginning, you mentioned something about Nazareth, and I don't know much about this topic, so I just Googled it real quick, and I have airmanblog.org. So this is from Bart Ehrman. He says this is something that a few mythicists will say, and if you don't mind, I just wanted to read the last part of it. He says, it's a huge piece. I can only read the last paragraph. He says, there is an even bigger problem, however. There are numerous compelling pieces of archaeological evidence that, in fact, Nazareth did exist in Jesus' day, and that, like other villages and towns in that part of Galilee, it was built on the hillside near where the later rock-cut tombs were built. For one thing, archaeologists have excavated a farm connected with the village, and it dates to the time of Jesus. He says, Psalm disputes the finding of the archaeologist. This is the guy he was responding to at the beginning. Then he goes, Psalm also claims, hold on, let me go all the way down. Apparently this brought me to the top. I'll just read the last paragraph. The AP story concludes, the dwelling and older discoveries of nearby tombs and burial caves suggest that Nazareth was an out-of-the-way hamlet for around 50 houses on a patch of about 4 acres, populated by Jews of modest means. He's quoting an expert here. And then Ehrman concludes, no wonder this place is never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, Josephus, or the Talmud. It was far too small, poor, and insignificant. Most people had never heard of it, and those who had heard of it didn't care. Even though it existed, this is not the place someone would make up as the hometown of the Messiah. Jesus really came from there, as attested in multiple sources.
Yeah, and I've read that too. So, and in which case, if that's true, then the phrase Jesus of Nazareth would have been pointless. I mean, it wouldn't have meant anything. No one doubts that there was habitation historically, archaeologically, in any part of that area through history, and that you can find pre-habitation. The question was, did the city of Nazareth exist during Jesus' time? And the probability of that being true is so close to zero. There's no evidence before at least 70 that was actually a city of Nazareth. So yeah, you can find things. I mean, you can find Indian arrowheads laying around here. You know, there was habitation, but that doesn't mean the city of Nazareth actually existed in that time, during the time Jesus lived.
I mean, that's one of the things I was going to bring up. Actually, this is straight from Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? And he actually goes through that exact AP story and that evidence of Nazareth. And Bart Ehrman makes clear that he is convinced by that evidence that Nazareth existed at the time of Jesus, and many other reasons for that. So are you saying that you're more qualified to make that judgment than Bart Ehrman, or?
I'm saying that Bart Ehrman would probably admit that his assessment is probabilistic.
Right.
And who knows where that falls.
And he put it closer to the 90%?
I don't know where he would put it.
Okay. But he put it more than likely.
But Bart Ehrman does, in some places, tend to exaggerate. In fact, his more recent book about how Jesus became God makes a very, very strong argument for a mythical Jesus. He used pretty much the same arguments that I use, although he is still...
He believes Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher.
Yeah, that he was a person, yeah.
Yeah, that he was, and he was an apocalyptic preacher, and we can know quite a bit about him.
And he might have been, yeah.
No,
I mean,
he was. Bart Ehrman uses almost certainly. He uses that language.
Well,
so
he might have been.
Where would you put that, 95%?
You'd have to ask him where he puts it.
Yeah, well, almost certainly sounds like 95%, but I guess we'll ask him.
A parallel would be somebody like I mentioned before, like Paul Bunyan. We don't know if Paul Bunyan existed. He might have.
What are the earliest sources for Paul Bunyan?
There's some stories written about 30 years after.
30 years, okay. So you agree that 2 years after Jesus' crucifixion, 1 Corinthians 15 goes back to 2 years.
But we don't have the document. We have Paul telling us.
We don't have it within Paul's letter?
No, we don't. That's not a document. That's Paul just telling us something.
But you agreed that it goes back to 2 years. You said that in Godless in 290.
But still, that's an oral thing. It might have been. But in any event, with Paul Bunyan...
Probabilistic, what percentage?
What I'm trying to say, Paul Bunyan might have existed.
Paul Bunyan's actually a bad example, wouldn't it be?
No, I'll tell you why. Paul Bunyan might have existed. We don't know where that probability is, right? He might have existed, he might not have. But the legendary Paul Bunyan, who dug the Great Lakes as a watering hole for his big blue ox, almost certainly did not exist. That legendary story that grew out of the early, and the same thing with this legend of Jesus.
If I have 500 plus eyewitnesses that said he saw that within 2 years of his death, I might think that Paul Bunyan did do those.
You don't have 500 eyewitnesses.
You don't have that? That's not what Paul says?
You have one guy saying that, but you don't have the eyewitnesses.
But again, what do scholars who actually study these things, who you completely neglect in your books, what do scholars who actually say these things believe about Paul's testimony?
Scholars believe that Paul believed that. Paul was not above exaggerating and making point. We have no way of corroborating
That's one of the reasons why Paul's early letters are so trusted. Galatians 1, Galatians 2, 1 Corinthians 15, because it's on Paul's credibility. It's on the line for him. He is defending himself as an apostle. This is why, like I said, all teaching scholars trust those early letters and those early sources in Paul. He's not lying. He may be wrong about what he's saying, but he's not lying about it. He's saying that these witnesses were there, and we can interview them and we can trust them.
We have no way to corroborate the reliability of Paul's writings because of other things he's written. We have no way of knowing if there actually were 500.
Except the critical tools of the historical method. Except those.
Which gives us probabilities.
Yeah, and those probabilities, according to all scholars, are what?
or that Paul believed that that happened, or at least he said
well
that it
over
happened.
90%, yes.
Paul said that it happened, right? Just like Joseph Smith said that those things happened with the angel Moroni and the gold tablets.
Yeah.
We have that testimony.
We also have the testimony that makes clear that Joseph Smith was a crackpot.
So, but we do have testimony.
Yeah, so we know. So where's the evidence that Paul was a crackpot?
Well, you know, my whole premise is that probabilities are not
We
yes
have a
or no.
unanimous amount of scholars teaching in the Western world who say that Joseph Smith is a reliable historian.
There's a lot of them who do, but you see
Really?
my point.
Really? Who is it? Tell me one non-Mormon who says Joseph Smith is a reliable historian.
So,
yeah, tell me one non-Mormon.
Well,
I'm telling you, non-Christian, all the scholars say this about Paul. Everyone.
But in any event, what we have is Paul.
He's not challenging it. It is true.
What we
It's a
have
fact.
is Paul saying that. Scholars agree that Paul said that.
Right.
Whether it's true or not is a different issue.
But they agree that Paul really believed it, and he is credible in saying that. Just like Josephus, most scholars agree that he is credible in saying what he saw, but he could have been wrong. But he is a credible historian.
Well,
Josephus, Tacitus, Paul's early letters are in the same league,
okay,
even
but,
more so.
But how much credibility do you give to a guy who hears a voice and sees a light in the sky and falls down and has a vision? I mean, how much credibility does that add?
Right.
It obviously diminishes it somewhat. That's all I'm saying.
For you, I think, but
for
not,
me, yes,
but not
for
for the
me.
6,000 plus scholars who are teaching
I'm the one
and
being
training.
asked to make a judgment about the veridicality of this statement.
Yeah.
And for me, it smells. It looks fishy to me. I'm not a believer.
People not trained in history, people not with scholarly credentials might believe that. You're right.
Question online from Don Terrell. Dan, you argued that God was sadistic, not that he was fabricated. How does arguing that God was a moral monster prove Jesus to be a legend?
Well, that was my point. My point was to use that evidence to show that he's not Lord. Because if he's the Lord, he's somebody we should admire and worship. And if he said he was the same God as the God of the Old Testament, there's no way he could be my Lord. So our debate is legend or Lord.
If he is Lord, if he is Lord of the world, if he is the omnipotent, all-knowing, all-good God, does he have the right to take life or not?
No.
No?
No, he does not.
According to you.
No, if
Now, Sean.
a Lord is somebody that I would accept as a superior to me, right?
So God can give us life, but he can't take it, is what you're saying.
Well, that's irrelevant.
Why is that irrelevant? That's exactly what
Because
you've been
you're
complaining about. God killed all these people. How dare he? He gave them all life, did he not?
No, he didn't. I mean, in the
No, he
Bible,
didn't.
in the Bible,
Yeah, in the Bible, assuming the Bible's true, if the God of Christianity is true, he created all these people.
No, he didn't.
He gave them
He
life.
created Adam and Eve.
But he created all people.
He
from
created Adam and
right?
Eve. The rest evolved through natural processes.
Okay, that's fine. But God created them all. If
No,
the
he
Bible's
didn't.
True.
He created Adam and Eve.
Right.
The Bible doesn't say he created all human beings. He created Adam and Eve, and then through natural biological
He created
processes,
the heavens and the earth. So
as if
he can,
we had evolved as natural
if
organisms.
he can give life, can he take it away?
Well, if he's that kind of a bully, even less respect would I have for him. If he's the kind of father who says, I brought these children into the world, I can smash them if I want. Am I going to call him a lord? I'm not. I'm going to call him a fiend.
Question, Dr. Bass.
Dr. Bass,
Yes,
you've relied several times on the claim that there were over 500 eyewitnesses of Jesus after the resurrection. Similarly, there must have been at least 5,000 eyewitnesses at the feeding of 5,000 miracle. And in Matthew 27:53, we read that when Jesus was crucified, several saints rose from the dead, walked out of their tombs, went into the city, and were seen by many. I mention all these because we have a lot of eyewitness accounts of these miracles. So my question is, with so many eyewitnesses, why is there not one single story passed down from one of these eyewitnesses?
Yeah, so I'm making my argument, like I said, from the historical bedrock facts. So the quote you're giving from Matthew 27, that quote is only testified by Matthew. Now, why that isn't testified by other things?
The people who saw it?
Say again?
Why is it not testified by the people who saw it?
Well, most people in the ancient world were illiterate. You know that, right?
So all of your witnesses were illiterate. And all 5,000 plus people who witnessed these miracles were illiterate and could not tell these stories to their children, who would tell their children.
No,
and so
well,
on?
some of them wrote them down clearly because we have the Gospels. Matthew and John wrote them down.
They were
there.
They were written decades after the event occurred.
That's right.
So they were not eyewitnesses.
Why were they not eyewitnesses? Because they wrote decades after the event. Josephus wrote about the Jewish war in AD 70 and AD 90. So was he not there?
You're saying that Matthew was alive, the anonymous author of Matthew was alive when the saints walked out of their tombs?
Matthew? Yes, he was one of the disciples of Jesus. But I'm not talking about that. I was talking about the feeding of the 5,000, which you brought up.
Okay.
The feeding of the 5,000, Matthew and John, 12 disciples of Jesus, they were there, and they wrote the Gospels, Matthew and John. Correct?
Matthew and John were written by anonymous authors.
Really?
Not by
that
the
sounded kind of like an
disciples.
oxymoron. Matthew and John were written by anonymous authors?
They were named
Is that what
by,
you said?
those Gospels were named by the church much later.
Right. And how do you know they're not written by Matthew and John? What's your evidence?
Historical evidence. I think Dan could speak to that as well.
Yeah, you should ask Dan to speak to that. It's clear.
Well, one reason we know that Matthew did not write Matthew is that he refers to Matthew in the third person. He didn't say I or me, this happened to me. He refers to Matthew as a character in the story. So that's one reason why we are pretty sure Matthew did not write the book of Matthew. However, I find it kind of interesting, and I'm wondering if Justin might elaborate on the fact that he suggested that because only Matthew tells the story about the zombies, with the graves open and they went back to their homes and their work, that weakens the historicity of the story because only one person told us the story? Is that what you were saying?
It weakens my ability to defend it, especially to people who are highly skeptical. So that's why I appeal to the unalterable bedrock facts that everyone agrees on.
So how many people witnessed the 500 that Paul talked about?
Paul is trustworthy according to all the scholars.
Were there any other writers who mentioned those 500?
Well, some say that Matthew 28 is a reference to the 500.
500? Did he say 500?
He didn't say that, but that's what many scholars think, that that's referring to the same event. But the point is, once again, what do people who actually study these things, who are trained in these things, who are not just ex-pastors who go out and tell people not to believe in Christianity,
so
what do people actually who are trained in history say this? 6,000 plus scholars will say you should trust Paul that there were 500 and that many of them you could actually interview at the time of Corinth.
So did the zombie story actually happen? Was Matthew telling the truth?
I believe it happened because I trust Matthew, but I'm not saying that I can defend it and I can give evidence for it to people who are highly skeptical.
So
it's like what Tom Cruise said in A Few Good Men. It doesn't matter what I believe, it matters what I can prove.
So it did happen. These graves of people who were dead for centuries came out of the graves. And
again, Dan, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, if God exists, are any of these miracles a problem for you?
I'm asking about the zombie story in Matthew,
okay.
the Halloween story.
I believe God existed and Jesus rose from the dead. So if those are true, would those things be a problem?
Well, then anything goes.
Does anything goes?
Really? If those miracles are true, then anything goes. We may as well throw out history. Anyone
No.
says anything.
The New Testament says nothing about Xeno being an overlord in the past.
Can I jump in?
That doesn't go.
Can I jump in? My question really was, how come we don't have any other eyewitness testimony to these miracles?
We have so little from the ancient world. There might have been things written. We know that there was actually 5 volumes called the Sayings of the Lord, written by Papias, who was one of the early church fathers who was a disciple of John the Apostle. And we don't have any of those writings at all. We have fragments quoted in Eusebius and Irenaeus. So there's so much we just don't have. But what we do have is enough, like I said, the unalterable bedrock facts to demonstrate that Jesus did rise again from the dead. So what did those 500 people see? That's the question.
But even these 5,000 people that witnessed a miracle, none of them would tell their story? Are miracles just happening all the time and they don't think it's special enough to write about it?
2 of them wrote about it, John and Matthew. How many more do you want?
Okay, 2 out of 5,000, you win.
Question from the floor for Dan. Dan, this is my daughter Simeon. Be nice.
I have to be nice. She gave me this pretty little bracelet. See that?
I got one
too.
So she's brilliant. Be careful, Dan. Be careful.
Okay, this is my first question to ask to an atheist, so please go easy on me. If you found out that you had cancer tomorrow and only had 2 weeks to live, would you live life to its fullest or would you try to find a cure?
Live life to the fullest.
I had 2 weeks to live and I had cancer. I would live like I'm living now. I mean, I'm living life to the fullest now. And yeah, I might try to find a cure. I mean, In my book, Life-Driven Purpose, I talk about that. Sometimes meaning in life comes from unexpected sources. You might have a brother or sister or a cousin who dies of some rare disease, and you say, I'm going to fight that disease. That gives meaning to your life. So I might decide to fight the cancer as well. I don't know how I would act, but I mean, we're all going to die. None of us are getting out of this alive. So one of these days, we're all going to die from something. It might be cancer.
How dare God take our life?
God's not taking our life. We're dying. Our bodies decay.
Right.
There's no God to give life or take life. It's a delusion, Justin. But in any event, what is the point of your question?
It works both ways.
Because I was really kind of hoping that you would mainly say that I would try to find a cure, because I think that mainly the cure would be trying to find Jesus in all of this and praying to him.
Yeah? Well, okay. Well, you know what? I think her question is very sweet. She cares about suffering. She cares about disease. She's a good girl. She really has a good moral heart. And so I don't want to come down hard on her for that. But why didn't Jesus do that when he was here? Why didn't he say, for example, wash your hands before you eat? By the way, boil your water, people. There's these little things called germs. Why didn't Jesus take care of those things? He should have known everything, right? Why were so many millions of needless deaths from disease if Jesus had the answer to that? So he failed us. He didn't do any better than any other person in the first century at the time.
He saved us from death, sin, and hell, but yeah, he didn't do much.
Yeah, what hell? There's no hell. You have to prove, you have to establish hell.
Jesus said there was hell and he rose from the dead.
Of course. Easy enough.
Question online from Amy for Dr. Jazz Barker. You compare the stories of Jesus to stories like Hercules. Do stories like Hercules have prophecies as the Jesus story did?
Yeah, some of those did have prophecies. There were the Sybaritic oracles and that. And I made it clear that I'm not making direct comparisons. All of these myths and pagan ideas and legends and all these religions kind of shared commonalities and kind of didn't. They all had uniquenesses. But you can see a kind of general template back in that time of history in that region of the world. You can kind of see a rough template of anybody who's anybody had to have some kind of a divine birth. I mean, if you're going to claim to be a god, you better have something like that under your belt, you know. So Hercules' mother apparently was impregnated by a snake, and so that's kind of an interesting kind of divine thing that happens. So, but the prophecies of Jesus are not prophecies of Jesus. There's no mention of the word Jesus in the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament got it wrong. It says that his name shall be Emmanuel. No one ever called him Emmanuel. In fact, that Isaiah 7:14 was a bad prophecy and misinterpreted. Matthew blew it. Matthew thought it was a prophecy, but he took a bad translation from the Septuagint. In fact, Matthew seemed to be in the habit of going back to the Old Testament and finding any reference to some kind of a child and saying, aha, that's the prophecy of Jesus. If you scratch beneath the surface, those prophecies are not prophecies at all. They are just in the mind of the New Testament writers who thought the Old Testament was talking about their pet Messiah choice.
I think the prophecies are very powerful. Daniel chapter 9 says that when the Messiah comes, he will be cut off, which means a violent death. And after that, the temple and Jerusalem will be destroyed. That's only happened twice in all human history. 586 BC, which was before that prophecy was written. And then in AD 70, the Romans came and destroyed the temple. So did any Messiah or someone claiming to be Messiah have a violent death before AD 70? There was a guy named Jesus that did. So I find that quite compelling.
Well, you know, one thing that does happen with believers who are writing histories of their faith is that they make it happen in their writings. Matthew was in the habit of making things happen.
How did Daniel make that happen? He was written 200 years before.
I'm not saying Daniel did. I'm saying the authors of the Old Testament, New Testament, looked back at the Old and said, oh, this would be a good prophecy.
The New Testament never quotes that one to say it was fulfilled.
Well, in any event, to claim that that is a prophecy of Jesus, didn't God know the name Jesus?
Do you think
Daniel?
Jesus' death and the temple being destroyed 40 years later had nothing to do with one another? Just coincidence?
If Jesus actually lived and died, the temple being destroyed was a totally different issue. But
yeah, it had nothing to do with each other. Okay. We have a prophecy.
We don't have a prophecy. It's not named Jesus. It's very vague.
It says the Messiah.
Once in a while, in fact, it would be a true miracle if a prophecy never came true. You throw enough spaghetti against the wall, some of it's going to stick. right? We should expect occasionally some prophecies to have what look like fulfillments. Otherwise, that would be a miracle. So by coincidence, I bet we could expect a small percentage of gospel writers writing things that look pretty close to what was supposedly prophesied in the Old Testament. That doesn't mean that the prophecy really came true. We have more examples of failed prophecies than we do of fulfilled prophecies.
You're free to be skeptical, Dan, but I think that the prophecy is pretty compelling.
You're free to be credible, but I think
I am credible.
I think the evidence is quite compromised.
Okay.
Question, Dr. Bass.
Yes, as maybe to link the ancient world with the modern world in this changing world, as a lifelong practicing heterosexual, acknowledging that the older I become, the less practice I get, I would like to know what evidence you have to prove that Jesus wasn't gay.
Say again?
That he wasn't gay? I never heard that question.
That Jesus wasn't gay?
What evidence you have to prove that Jesus was not gay?
Meaning happy?
No.
I'm happy and gay.
Gay, as in the current use of the word.
Okay, all right.
Either
Just
way.
clarifying terms.
Yeah. Well, regardless, he stayed single all his life. He chose celibacy.
He was around men all the time and treated women, including his mother, very badly.
Oh, really? How did he treat his mother badly?
Well, I can't argue the book because
Yeah.
both times
another one you need to refer to, Dan?
I tried to read it. I couldn't get past page 2 before I threw it in the trash.
Okay, there's not pages in it, but yeah.
Well, whatever.
Question
That was
for
the best
Mr.
argument
Barker.
of the night. Best argument.
Yes, is Dan Barker?
Yeah.
Well, first, before I ask my question, I just want to say thank you. According to my minority friend, I'm the first minority up here. Thank you guys for allowing me up here.
Woo-hoo.
Racial equality. But my question is, that's kind of a two-part question. One, you continue to speak on the aspect of the credibility of the Bible not being so. What are some of your extra biblical sources saying that Jesus did not exist? Because there are some written by certain scholars like Josephus that speak on the existence of Jesus. And then also from the aspect of the credibility of the Bible when it comes to a lot of the other great things like from Socrates or Homer of the Iliad. I might have misquoted that, but those have a large time gap within the aspect of 2,000 years for the earliest manuscripts. But when it comes to the New Testament and the Old Testament of the Bible, the gap is little between 200 to 100 years, even sort of decades after they were actually written, so copied. So my question is, what is your extra biblical sources for the aspect of Jesus not existing, and how can you account for the aspect of the Bible having more recent copies than things like the Iliad?
Okay, technically, you're not the first minority up here. My dad's a Native American, and I belong to the Lenape tribe of American Indians. My mother was Swedish, so I guess I'm a Swede Indian.
Sweet Indian? Nice.
You know, I have so much respect for my native culture, which, by the way, was almost exterminated by the loving Christians from Europe.
That was a joke.
Who came over from?
That was a
I know,
joke.
I understand.
That was not at all. No, it was just a joke.
The Europeans who came with a gun in one hand and a Bible in the other and tried to civilize the tribe and almost drove us to extinction in the name of Jesus and through the church. But in any event, there were skeptics. Origen was writing, having a written debate against a guy named Celsus, and they were going back and forth, and there were pagans arguing with Christians back and forth. And like I mentioned, Justin Martyr was talking with pagans too. And there was a guy, we don't know how accurate this is, but there was a guy named Thallus. Julius Africanus tells us there was a guy named Thallus who wrote a book questioning for example, the eclipse of the sun during the death of Jesus, because it couldn't have happened. You couldn't have had a solar eclipse during the time of the Passover, which was at the new moon. At the full moon. So that was impossible. So there were skeptics, there were people writing, but those were late. Those were 2nd century or more. And of course there were doubters at the time, but the length of time is not that relevant, really. Look at the story of Medjugorje in former Yugoslavia. It was 2 days It took 2 days for that story to become a wide legend of the Virgin Mary appeared, and people, thousands of people flocked, thousands of people claimed to be healed. We have names and addresses of the people who actually claim to have seen the Virgin Mary out in that field there in Yugoslavia. So the amount of time, the fact that it's short doesn't mean, the story of Elian Gonzalez, remember the dolphin and the kid from Cuba who landed in Miami? And there were sightings of the Virgin Mary, and that myth took about 4 days to totally blow up into a huge movement. So the length of time, myths and legend can happen really, really fast. So the fact that the Gospels might have been within a few decades or a few years even doesn't mean they are actually more truthful in what they're claiming. It just means that there were people who believed in that, just like Medjugorje.
The reason why I asked that question is because you guys reference a whole lot of aspect of like eyewitnesses and stuff like that. So wouldn't an eyewitness have something written a lot closer to the actual date that it happened than actually having copies years and years and years farther than when it actually happened? Wouldn't that make it a little bit more relevant?
Well, do you believe in the virgin sighting of Medjugorje? There was like 2 or 3 days. We had actual written testimony.
I've never heard of it. I think that probably happened before I was born.
But
I
happened.
trust it because of the historical.
But you would discount the story, even though it was a few days with actual people's names that we can interview and who will swear to you that they saw the Virgin Mary. You would discount it, wouldn't you? Regardless of how close in time it was. It's a myth. There are some scholars who try to say that it was so close in time that it makes it much more likely to have been true. Sometimes the opposite might be true.
Thank you.
You mentioned people outside the Bible referring to Jesus, so just to talk about that. Josephus mentions Jesus. Tacitus mentions Josephus. Mentions Jesus.
No, he doesn't.
Suetonius.
No, they don't.
Which one?
Tacitus does not mention Jesus.
Well, he says Christos was crucified.
Christus, yeah.
Crucified under
But he didn't
Pontius
mention
Pilate.
Jesus. He mentioned a Christ.
What do all Tacitian scholars say about that text? What do they say about whether or not that was Jesus or not?
Well, Jesus was never in Rome. He said there was an uprising by Christus.
I had a question
in
about
Rome.
Tacitian scholars. What do scholars of Tacitus who actually study Tacitus, who read the Latin, what do they say about that text?
If you read, I have it here with me. You want me to dig it out and read it, actually? What Tacitus
what do scholars
actually
say
says?
about Tacitus, though?
I've
Do they
read-
say that that's about Christ, or do they say it's not about Jesus?
They say Christ, but
Okay, so
you
it is
said-
about Jesus.
No, it's about Christ.
Okay, but Christ is the person Jesus.
We're talking about Jesus, a historical person. Christ is a title. But Crestus was a common name in Rome. There were a lot of people called Crestus at the time.
Jesus was a name of a person, right?
Yeah, Jesus,
Okay.
but Tacitus does not mention Jesus.
Yes, he doesn't say the name Jesus, but when he says Christos is crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he talks about Christians, what's he talking about?
Shall we look it up? Do we have time for me to dig up
I just
the actual...
told you the key text. He says Christians, he says Christos. Who's he talking about according to Tacitus scholars?
In the second...
Again, you must disagree with everyone who studies these things, but what do they say?
In the 2nd century,
Right.
Tacitus and Suetonius, around the year 112, 117, and
Right.
others, were reporting what they had heard. They were not eyewitness testimony. They were not writing...
But they are talking about the Jesus and Christianity that we're talking about, right?
We don't know that.
When
They're
they say Christians,
it could have been another Christ.
Another Christ?
It could have been. There were other Christs.
Yeah, but they don't use the word Christ.
There was a Judas the Christ. There was a
Where
Theudas the
does
Christ.
it say Judas the Christ or Theudas the Christ? Where does it
Josephus
say
talks about a Judas
No, he
the
only
Christ.
uses Christ twice in his entire writings, and you know who he's talking about? Jesus.
In any event, there were other self-proclaimed messiahs.
Christos, the Greek word, is used in Josephus only twice.
But you get my point. They did not mention Jesus.
Your point's wrong.
They did not mention Jesus. They could have, but they didn't.
Josephus says Jesus. Jesus, the brother of James.
Josephus, in his highly doctored,
Highly doctored? No, that one is not doctored at all. That one, have you read Robert Van Vorst?
I haven't, but
Jesus
I know
outside
that...
the New Testament. This is considered the standard text for these things.
Do you want me to just break in? Or?
just break in.
Question,
Okay.
Dr. Bass.
All right, Dr. Bass. Okay.
No one questions that brother of James.
Right. Okay. So considering that the Mosaic Law dictated that Hebrews were required to stone Hebrews for blasphemy, why was it necessary for the Sadducees to wake Pilate up in the night to convince him to kill somebody when it's historical from even Josephus that Pilate would kill people for fun? He was a ruthless leader. And a second question, do you believe that Pilate actually, his soul is trapped in a lake at the top of a mountain in Switzerland called Pilatus?
The second one I've never heard of, definitely not. Where does Pilate say, where does Josephus say Pilate killed people for fun? What text?
It is historical that,
Oh,
that
it
Pilate was a ruthless tyrant.
True, he was, but he did it for fun. Where does it say that?
I mean,
Okay, you just made that up. You just made that up.
How could you? I mean, what?
Okay,
what
so the reason
just
why
suppose his
the
motives. He was-
stoning of
he didn't
blasphemy
need
doesn't
convincing.
affect Jesus is because that was under theocratic Israel. Theocratic Israel was not under Rome's control, which Israel was under Rome's control at the time of Jesus. Therefore, they needed Pilate to have Jesus
And
crucified.
where was that amendment to the Judaic law written down?
Where was that amendment? It happened when another power took over them. That's what happened in 586 BC when the Babylonians took over.
So where is this source that says?
So you doubt the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BC? Yes. Yeah. Well, that's when Israel stopped being a theocratic nation, is what I'm saying. They didn't throw it away. They just couldn't apply those things. They couldn't apply the death penalty when they had a power over them who were applying the death penalty. They would themselves be killed. So no, Jews couldn't just go around killing people when the Romans were in charge. Like I said, Maximus, Russell Crowe would be sent out to kill him.
That's if they knew he was a little-known kind of person on the side that they could have.
Which begs the question again: why do a third of the world worship that little-known person, right?
Question, Dr. Barker?
Okay, my question for Dr. Barker. A lot of Christians put feelings and Jesus centers their heart and emotions into why they believe in God and why they believe in Jesus. Since you've left Christianity, do you still get those same feelings and emotions that you got as a believer? Do you get them now in your life after you've left the church?
Yeah, I do, even better. I used to feel it, I used to get goosebumps. I used to think the goosebumps, by the way, I used to preach that you don't need to have those feelings. You're saved by faith, right? That if you don't have the feelings, it doesn't mean you're not saved. But I was one of those people on the tail end of the bell curve that got all the feelings, and I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. I spoke in tongues even, and I just felt the Spirit of God, and I thought goosebumps were evidence of the Holy Spirit, when actually goosebumps are evidence of evolution, really, when you think about the hairier ancestors we used to have. But in fact, once in a while I'll still go out, it seems really stupid, but I'll still go out and do that, and I get all those feelings again, but they don't compare with the almost ecstatic feelings, the natural feelings of playing in a jazz combo with a good bunch of musicians. I got to tell you, that beats belief in Jesus 100 times. I mean, we're human beings. We have our feelings. Some Christians sit in church, they don't feel anything. Others sit in church with tears in their eyes, so we're all different. But Christians in the religious experience, as real as it is, it's just a human experience.
I would say whether atheist or Christian, we shouldn't go off our feelings. We should go off the evidence like I presented.
Well, I agree with that.
Question from David for Dr. Bass. You've argued from authority many times, claiming consensus from most biblical scholars, but does it change?
No, I said all. I said all.
All, okay.
Yeah, correct him.
But
Thank you.
does it change the reliability of those scholars when we learn that 70% of biblical scholars in the U.S. work in religious institutions, and that at least 40% of them are contractually obligated to declare that they will always believe in evangelical doctrines?
That's okay. Did y'all not hear that? You want to say it again? I get what he's saying, but I didn't know if the audience heard. He's saying because many of the scholars are forced to sign like they believe in inerrancy or something like that, does that affect it? Well, like I said, let's just take all the critical scholars. Let's just take the Jesus seminars. Just take them. I'll take just them. They agree with all the facts that I'm saying, that I laid out tonight. So let's take the ones that don't have any type of bias that they have to sign, this document or whatever. Let's take them. They all agree on those 7 facts.
They might agree with you on the crucifixion and the historical existence of Jesus. They don't agree with you on the resurrection of Jesus.
No, not on the. I never said that was one of my facts. I said one of the facts is.
So
I said that's the best explanation of the facts.
So do you respect?
And I haven't heard you give one other explanation of those 7 facts better than the resurrection.
Do you respect the Jesus Seminar's opinion about the resurrection of Jesus?
Well, I think that comes into another thing. See, what we have to come to is the facts. Facts are things that we can agree on, whether we're atheist, Christian, Muslim. Facts are stubborn things. We can just agree on them, right? So when someone has anti-supernatural bias or supernatural bias, the facts can get muddled. So let's deal with the things that we all agree on, and then let's say, what's the best explanation for those facts? And that's what I'm doing. I'm saying, let's go common ground. Here's common ground, 7 facts that everyone agrees on. What's the best explanation? I haven't heard from you yet. What another
Of course you have.
counter
I
explanation?
made a very strong argument for legend.
You made a strong argument that Jesus is bad.
I made a strong argument for legendary growth of the stories across time.
Legendary
in the first
growth.
century.
How many appearances are in Paul, and then how many appearances are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John?
The appearances are not extraordinary events.
Really? Jesus
No.
appearing to people is not extraordinary?
No, it's not. That happens all
Really?
the time. People see grandma all the time.
No, but the physical body of Jesus
They did not
appearing
see.
to... Oh, yeah, we
it was
did
not
that.
the physical body. That's where we differ.
Yeah.
You're
But
imposing
you've already...
a bias.
No. You're not reading the text, because Paul makes clear that the general resurrection of the dead is physical. You agreed with that. And if I take you after text, Paul says the grounding of that general resurrection is Jesus' bodily resurrection. That's what he says.
But that's still not what
he says. Our body will be transformed like his body, Philippians 3:20 and 21. Is that not what it says?
Do you know that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul knew the word resurrection, anastasis. He knew that word, but he didn't use it in there.
He uses it for Jesus' resurrection in Romans chapter 1, verse 4.
He used the word agiro.
Anastasis is used in Romans chapter 1, verse 4
But
for
in 1
Jesus'
Corinthians
resurrection.
15, the earliest...
Did Paul write Romans?
Let me finish what I'm saying here. In 1 Corinthians 15, in that formula that Paul wrote, he did not use the word, he used the word agiro, which just meant wake up, like when Jesus was on the boat.
Did he not use agiro and anastasis in synonymous terms?
In some other places?
All throughout 1 Corinthians 15.
We're talking about...
All throughout 1 Corinthians 15, he uses anastasis for the resurrection of the dead.
But Paul is
With the
supposedly
gyro.
passing on to us an earlier formula from someone else.
You keep
That
going away
formula,
from the facts. Why don't you just admit to the facts? The facts are, Paul says anastasis when he talks about the resurrection of Jesus in Romans 1:4, and for the resurrection of all believers in 1 Corinthians 15.
So, if I may, my
Garrett,
question...
how dare you interrupt me?
Wow, Garrett.
Well,
question for Dr. Bass
you
and
guys
Garrett.
were just-
I'm bringing sexy back Sanders.
you guys were just looking so spectacular up there. I just had to acquaint myself with you fellas. So my question really feeds into exactly what you guys were talking about. And Justin, you argued earlier that Jews, it's quite remarkable that Jews would change their beliefs about the resurrection or someone being able to resurrect before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. And what occurs to me is that it would be remarkable if we were talking about the entire Jewish nation changing all their beliefs about someone resurrecting, but we're talking about maybe 1% of the Jewish community who followed Christ, and it does seem to me not too far off from...
What did that 1% end up becoming?
Well, they became...
100%? Okay, keep going.
That's true. So... the Pharisees did believe in resurrection of the dead for all people at the end of the world, and if, as you know, scholars believe that Jesus said the end of the world was coming soon, and they might have thought that he was dead, they might have had some kind of visionary experience, might they have thought that the end of the world was happening, and this was, you know, the bodily resurrection of the dead predicted by the Pharisees? Wouldn't that be pretty natural?
That would. That's a good point, except for the fact that, like I said, Paul still, in all our early writings, are distinguishing between Jesus' bodily resurrection and the resurrection, the general resurrection at the end of the world. So they still believe that general resurrection is coming, but they're saying that this Jesus rose from the dead. That began the Daniel 12 physical resurrection in the middle of history. That's what's so unique, and that's what Paul says, that's what all of them say.
So by comparison, and Dan, you may be able to actually fill us in with a little bit more knowledge on this if you know anything about it. The Rabbi Sneerson, the Messiah for his, somewhere around a third of the Hasidic Jews in existence today, millions and millions of Jews, we learned from sociologists like T.M. Lerman that he's actually been seen alive by his Jewish followers, and of course Jews today still have similar conceptions about the afterlife. So wouldn't that be just as remarkable as this transformation among Jesus' disciples?
I just heard of them today. Do they have more followers than Scientologists or less?
Well, there's actually a day in the United States, if you're unaware of this, Education Day is a day in the United States. I don't know what day it is, but it's the day for education, celebrating education. And it is also Rabbi Sneerson Day. He was a great figure. He was he was rescued out of the Holocaust escapees, and he rose to prominence, creating, just basically taking charge of the remaining Jewish people. So that's why he's so celebrated. Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I think your basic general point is interesting. There were self-proclaimed messiahs through Jewish history, some of which had a following, larger or not. The Jesus following might have disappeared if it weren't for Constantine imposing religion by the force of government and the sword on the Western world and killing out all the sects, especially the Gnostic sects. But the important thing is, regardless of these little Jewish self-proclaimed Messiah sects like Schneerson and that, most Jews do not see Jesus as the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Messiah. If it's so clear and obvious, why is it that most Jews reject Jesus as their Messiah? They should know better than I, and they should know better than Justin.
This is why you need to read Romans 9 through 11.
Okay, thank you.
Question for Mr. Barker.
Yeah.
Yes, nice finally meeting you two. This is my first debate I've been to, so kind of excited to be here. So Dan, I noticed that you're making the case that Jesus is not Lord because Jesus is a moral monster based upon your own human moral compass. So since you referred to the Beatitudes, I think it's only fair to question that point. You said something like the Beatitudes should be about doing what's right to other people because people are inherent, valuable human beings. So my question is this: you sound as though you're giving intrinsic value to human beings and not just instrumental value, which naturalism doesn't provide intrinsic value unless you're a Platonist and believe on faith that intrinsic value exists somewhere out there. And you sound like you also believe that objective moral values exist. If that is so, then how does your worldview even ground intrinsic value and objective moral values? Are they just illusory? Are we all being deceived?
Yeah, good question. And we do whole debates on that. Maybe we should debate morality. And we don't have time to talk about it.
We're talking about God being a
know,
moral
let me answer.
monster. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and he is by his actions. He cares more about himself.
I'm sorry, I'm not asking about his actions.
I know that. I know what you're asking. Let me answer it. I know what you're asking.
So how can you even accuse him if you cannot ground your worldview?
But we can ground a worldview in a moral philosophy grounded in a natural world.
How?
As if we humans exist. We didn't have to. But since we do, and since we have the instincts and the love for our species that all species have for themselves, then we assume intrinsic value to ourselves, just like polar bears would assume it to themselves. There is no intrinsic...
So it's illusory.
It's not illusory if we're assuming it. Music is not illusory. We create it, right? So art is not illusory.
So we create it, okay.
So in the cosmos, there is no ultimate absolute value to human life. We're all going to die. The species is going to go away. But within ourselves, relative to our own species, as a mother, if any of your mothers, you have this instinct to love and cherish and protect your kids. You would kill for your kids, right?
That's right.
We
is
have
that illusory?
that. It's not illusory. It's real because it's happening within our species. It's not a cosmic, absolute thing that's out there. It's the same thing that any group, any species would care about themselves. So
it's real based upon our emotions and our feelings, which are subjective?
It's real based on the need to minimize harm in the real world. The whole idea of morality is harm. And anything that causes needless harm should be denounced. The God of the Bible should be denounced because he caused needless harm, not because I don't like him.
So now you're changing it to, we have intrinsic value because...
of harm.
Because of harm.
Harm is natural.
So why should we care about other people who are not related to us? I thought, we have the selfish gene. We should only care about,
Well, you're hitting a real straw man here, on morality. We care because we care. We care because we do. Because we would not exist if we didn't care. If our ancestors did not care about preserving their offspring, we wouldn't be here. Many species have gone extinct.
Wait. So if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be here. So is that kind of like, if we didn't have Christianity, since, a lot of us believe in Christianity, we wouldn't be here?
I guess I don't follow your question. All I can say is that there are solid
So 'cause
natural
it's
explanations
here,
for
then-
justifying moral value. There are no such things as absolute moral values. A value is a judgment of a mind. So it's an oxymoron.
Well, I'm asking you about objective moral values. So do you believe in objective moral values, or are you a relativist? Do you believe in subjective moral values?
I believe that moral values can be objectively justified. I don't think there is such a thing
So
as...
they don't exist.
They exist as a function of our brain. Hunger exists, doesn't it? Doesn't hunger exist?
Yes, it does.
As a function of our brain,
It does.
right? Pity, love exists as a function of a functioning organism. Those things exist within our species. They're not cosmic entities out there. When our species disappears, all of that will go with it.
Okay.
That's the beauty of humanity, that we
so
have those.
basically you say you believe that you can justify it, but you didn't really justify it.
Yes, I did, by harm.
Because it's in our head.
No, you
that
justify
we
it.
shouldn't harm other people.
Listen carefully.
Thank you. Okay.
Listen carefully.
Okay, I got it.
I don't think you get it at all. I'm pretty sure you don't. Our objective values, our values can be objectively justified by reference to the real world, and in the real world it's harm. Harm is material and physical and natural. So any action that leans toward unnecessary harm is what we define as bad. Any action that leans away from unnecessary harm, we in our species define that objectively by looking at the real world as harmful. And so the God of the Bible is an unnecessarily harmful being that I can objectively judge as a bully.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Albert Camus has a good word here. He says, from the moment that man subjects God to a moral judgment, he kills him in himself. But what becomes of the basis of morality then? Man denies God in the name of righteousness, but can he understand the idea of righteousness without the idea of God?
Bo?
Yeah. I was going to ask Dan a question, but this line was shorter. So I'll ask you a question. Maybe Dan can follow up with his analysis afterwards. I'm
not as popular.
I was thinking about the debate and thinking about trying to sum up both points, and then maybe both of you could give your analysis. So you laid out 7 points, 7 facts, and then basically you're looking for an inference to the best explanation of these 7 facts. I know we debated some of these facts here tonight. I don't know that we heard any alternative explanation from Dan regarding another explanation. Yours was that Jesus raised from the dead. So that's the explanation that the early church gave.
Seems like a pretty good one.
And then Dan, his speech relied on, he wasn't certain about the historicity of Jesus. There's some elements of possibly borrowing from pagan mythologies prior to this historical figure. But then he granted maybe Jesus did exist, it's possible. And then we heard, more or less a personal sort of tirade about the morality of the Old Testament God and then also Jesus. So to sum it up, Dan doesn't like Jesus. And so that was the arguments that I heard. So maybe Justin, what is your analysis of that? And then in particular, what do you think explanation could Dan possibly give? And then maybe Dan can answer this question, that what did these people experience? What alternative explanation could there possibly be that they did experience? In particular, James, the brother of Jesus, and then Paul. I know we disagree about whether or not it was spiritual or physical. That's sort of beside the point. What possible explanation could there be of this kind of radical transformation? And what is your analysis so far about the debate?
Yeah, I don't want to give Dan arguments here, but I think hallucination hypothesis, there's some legitimate, that's what Bart Ehrman thinks, that's a legitimate alternative explanation that he has put forth. I think it's weak. I don't think it survives the 7 facts, but I think that would be one. But I don't think we've heard anything that touches our 7 facts. We've heard things that attack inerrancy, that attack what he thinks is not moral in the Bible. That's all we've heard. We haven't heard anything said about the actual facts that have been laid on the table tonight.
Well, of course, in my opening, I laid 6 arguments that lower the probability, and pagan parallels is one of them. The fact that the Jesus myth seems to be cut from the same fabric in many ways, not all the ways, and the evidence for legendary growth, and we're actually doing 2 debates because it's legend or Lord. So we're actually debating 2 different things. So which do you pick? So I decided to focus on the Lord aspect. So obviously, and I think to a lot of Christians, they haven't heard any informed criticism of this Jesus that they pretend to love. But I will offer one. I don't think they've heard this kind of informed criticism about Jesus before. Many of them. Maybe you have because you read the books. But let me just offer one. I don't think the hallucination hypothesis is that strong either. It's possible. People hallucinate. People have seen, people, schizophrenics, Paul might have been schizophrenic. We don't know.
So what do
That's
they
possible.
say?
Here's what I think is most likely to have happened, and the scholar Robert Price brings this up as a very likely candidate for what happened. Jesus had a bunch of followers. They were expecting the kingdom to be set up on the earth, and then he was crucified. And the disciples were devastated. After Good Friday comes Black Sabbath, right? And the day when the disciples were like totally devastated, Jesus was dead. And Peter, who had just denied Christ, 3 times he denied Christ, and Peter, who was, acting rash, felt really bad. Suppose you had a bad argument with your wife. Suppose you and Allison had a really bad argument, right? And then she died before you get a chance to patch it up. How would you feel? Like, oh, wait a minute, I wanted to say something to her. So Peter, during this Black Sabbath, oh, no, I denied Christ, our Savior, and the kingdom is all dead, and please forgive me. And he prays to, dear God, dear Jesus, please. Because in those days, just like today, people believed that when people died, their spirit went up to heaven. Not their body, but their spirit. Like when grandma dies, she went up to heaven, right? We all think that. And the early disciples would have thought something like that. Jesus' spirit went to heaven. And then Paul is talking, of course, all human beings have that idea that your spirit goes to heaven.
You're projecting your 21st century American idea of heaven and afterlife from America.
In any event, they believed in
spirits.
spirits. They did believe in spirits. The spirits came from another realm like tongues of fire.
First century Jews, Pharisees believed in actually bodily resurrection.
But let me finish my hypothesis here. I'm just admitting it's one naturalistic hypothesis, right? In addition to the, stealing the body or to the swoon theory, which I think is very weak, and hallucinations. But Peter then prays, forgive me, Jesus, forgive me. And then he feels an answer to prayer. Oh, Jesus forgave me. And he tells the other disciples, I prayed to Jesus and he forgave me. You talked to Jesus? Peter talked to Jesus? He's alive, he lives, he's up there. And so an origin of the myth could start with something like that, a totally naturalistic misunderstanding of what somebody has said. I'm not saying that's true, but it's on the table.
That would explain Peter, but that wouldn't at all explain Paul, who we already established was fighting against Christianity and then for some reason changed. Again, though, what's your evidence that happened to Peter, other than Robert Price?
Well, he was asking for alternative
right, but what's your evidence
explanations.
for that? But an explanation, you should have some evidence, right? You say very clearly in your books you value evidence.
Well, the story itself.
So that was just made up, right?
No, it wasn't just made up.
That wasn't. So what's Robert Price's evidence?
The story itself, as you say, cries out for an explanation of the facts, right?
Right. And they said Jesus rose from the dead. So where does it say Peter's crying and saying, "Oh, I wish I had talked to Jesus"? Where does it say that?
But they didn't say that he bodily rose back then. It was a spiritual ascension. Egiro.
We already talked about
the word. Yes, we've talked about it, and you don't get it.
Romans 1:4 says anastasis. You say in your books, and you said already tonight, that anastasis, which does all over the place in the ancient world mean resurrection.
But in the very beginning,
that's what Paul said.
On Black Sabbath. Paul wasn't there on Black Sabbath. Paul wasn't there when Peter and the disciples were in distress.
Right, but he talked to him, and he said in Romans 1:4 that Jesus' resurrection was anastasis from the dead.
Well, he talked about that later, but in the original, they might have believed that later. After
okay, so now you agree Paul did believe in a bodily resurrection.
Well, yeah, later, but when that 1 Corinthians 15...
That's 25 years, and he's citing sources
You're
that go back to
confusing something, Justin.
He said Christ died, Christ buried.
You're equivocating here, Justin.
And he rose from the dead. Now, which one of those is spiritual, which one is physical?
In 1 Corinthians 15 is what we were limiting our conversation to,
right, okay,
not to all the other stuff.
Let's limit it to 1 Corinthians 15. Christ died. Is that physical?
Yeah, that was physical.
Okay.
If he existed,
he was
died
buried.
physically.
Is that physical?
Yeah, that was physical.
Okay. He was raised from the dead. Is that physical?
No.
No. Okay. And
That's
what's your
not.
evidence for that again?
The evidence is the word itself.
Okay, and that word is used by Paul,
He
uses it for anastasis.
But in 1 Corinthians 15, he did not use anastasis. He used egiro.
He uses anastasis even in 1 Corinthians 15. He uses it,
but not in that
synonymous
formula.
with the gyro.
Not in that formula.
No, yeah, let's look at it.
Look at it.
Parker. No,
I'm sorry, you're wrong about that.
No,
look
no,
at 1 Corinthians 15. Paul did not use the word resurrection.
You know
he
what?
did not.
I'll say, I could be in the matrix, but I'm 100% sure on that one. But
Last question, Mr. Barker.
Dr. Barker, so I was really disappointed. I didn't see you seriously engage directly Dr. Justin Bass's seven fact argument. But even though you didn't, I have a question for you. Suppose that as a Christian, I buy your argument that Jesus and Yahweh are moral monsters. My first reaction as a Christian is not to reject Jesus as my Lord, it's to give up biblical inerrancy. So in that sense, I can then rely on Justin Bass's argument for the resurrection. So both of your arguments are not mutually exclusive. So given that sort of undercuts your argument a little bit, what is left of your argument for me to deny Jesus as my Lord?
If you're giving up biblical inerrancy, then almost anything goes. Not everything, but almost anything goes. You may as well say, in fact, Augustine talked about that.
Do my seven facts go?
Yeah, the scholars don't necessarily hold to biblical inerrancy. So how do those scholars account for the resurrection if there are theists like myself?
Many of them subscribe to what I argued for. If I had more time, I'd do it more. The legend hypothesis. Not necessarily myth, but that the story started off as a simple story of Peter thinking that Jesus had ascended spiritually to heaven, and over the years it grew. There was no actual extraordinary event in the first stories, but as you see the passage of time to the first century, you see more and more miracles until finally there's one angel at the tomb. Oh, now later there's two angels at the tomb, and now there's two men dressed in white, and then you can see the actual legendary growth through time. That is one evidence that lowers the probability of the actual historicity of those later stories. What happened in the beginning?
500 plus witnesses.
No, he doesn't.
All four Gospels have a total of 20 witnesses. Legendary development backwards.
And I'll grant you those contradictories or supposed contradictions, but that doesn't deny that the tomb was empty, and I didn't hear an explanation for the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances on that.
Okay, and that's good. That would be a different debate. We'd be debating the resurrection of Jesus, which can take 4 hours to debate. If you're interested in that, what's your name? Who asked the question?
I'm Nolan.
Noah? If you're interested in that, I have some handouts in the back that detail at least 17 irreconcilable contradictions in the resurrection stories, and there's a challenge there that I challenge you to take. Take the gospel accounts and the account in 1 Corinthians and in Acts. Take it and write a coherent narrative of the facts that happened. It's on the back table. You're welcome to do that, but that's a different debate. And so you can't accuse an opponent of failing to address every argument in total detail with a time limit like that.
Yeah, that's a common thing. So there's all these contradictions in the resurrection accounts, but what do they agree on?
Well, they agree on some things, but...
Empty tomb, women, angels, resurrection of Jesus?
But they don't agree on the angels.
They don't agree? They agree on an angel there, at least
one of them says one young man, one of them says two young men, one of them says one angel, one of them says two angels.
So would you say that things they agree on are more important than the things they disagree on, or less important?
It depends on it. For example, the first appearance of Jesus, the first post-resurrection appearance of Jesus was either in Jerusalem or it was in Galilee.
Right.
Matthew says it was in Galilee, very clearly. So, for example, people say...
Luke says that he appeared to people for over 40 days. Do you think it's possible he appeared other than just...
Well, that's a contradiction. In my list shows that it's contradictory.
Okay. But even if the contradiction is true, let's grant your contradiction. Okay, so there's many historical accounts in the ancient world. I don't think most people consider those accounts inerrant. Most historians, like Josephus or the burning of Rome.
So you agree there's mistakes?
I'm saying let's assume it for the sake of argument. There's mistakes, there's contradictions, but what does it then point to? It points to the agreement. It points to that something of colossal magnitude happened. So the best you've done is challenge inerrancy. You've done nothing but prove even more strongly the resurrection.
No, it's opposite.
No.
You know that Matthew and Luke based their writings on Mark. Here's the example. People sometimes say that different witnesses of an auto accident would disagree on the color of the car, or they'll disagree on the same story. But what if one person said the accident happened in Dallas, and the other person said it happened in Fort Worth? You would be pretty sure something's wrong with at least one of those stories. The reliability of the witnesses would be
that's apples and
compromised.
oranges because, again, we're dealing with appearances, and one of them says it happened over a 40-day time period.
But
so some of the gospel writers could be emphasizing the Galilee appearances, and others could be emphasizing the Jerusalem appearances.
No, you don't know the story.
I know the story.
One of the accounts...
But again, see, you're still arguing against inerrancy. Why don't you argue with the actual facts? Why don't you argue against the actual
Are you saying
argument?
that the fact that there are internal contradictions within the story
this
doesn't weaken the probability?
Yeah. You left Christianity because of inerrancy, but I'm saying that there are many people who stay within Christianity even if the Bible is not inerrant.
All right,
because they believe
their
that Jesus,
choice.
because they believe that Jesus rose from the dead, even if there are mistakes in the Bible. There are
Well,
actually people who believe that.
That's their choice, but I can't do that.
Okay, but your arguments have done nothing to affect them, is what I'm saying.
I
Their
bet they
arguments
have.
for the
I bet you there are
resurrection-
believers here whose confidence has been altered a little bit after hearing some of the things I've said tonight. I bet you there are.
This question
Dr.
is
Ferrer
for
for Dr. Bass.
This
That
question
would be
is
surprising.
for Justin Bass.
It happened to me. It happens to a lot of people, Justin.
You're right. Fundamentalist people who think that the King James Bible is the only word of God and every word is inerrant, and when they find out, oh my goodness, there's the longer ending of Mark, oh my goodness, this must not be true then. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's ridiculous.
But
that's
you-
that's rejecting a fundamentalist
But
interpretation
you
of
do
Christianity.
know that it compromises the reliability of the witnesses. At least that. You have to
No,
admit
no, no,
that.
no, no. I've got a question.
Dr. Ferrer.
Not
I've
at
got
all.
a question for Justin Bass, but first I wanted to commend you two on a lively debate, a lot of energy up here, and I think the audience, if I'm not mistaken, because of the temperature in this room, the probability of the doctrine of hell is just a little bit higher in our minds as a result. Just a little bit. But I noticed as you were developing your case, you appealed to scholarly consensus, and some might say that that's a fallacy to appeal to authorities. But at the same time, I was comparing Barker's response, and I noticed the authorities he appealed to was his interpretation of Scripture overwhelmingly, and I caught a Richard Dawkins quote, but just those two. That's really all I got. So can you comment on how appealing to peer-reviewed scholarship can help correct against fallacious appeal to self-authority, equivocation, anachronism, steamrolling in a debate, hasty generalization, and a lot of those other potential fallacies that a person might slip in because they're not submitting their opinions to peer review?
And we should probably wait till he returns. I don't want to go after him while he's not here to defend himself. So maybe but yes, I mean, I'm appealing to the fact that all scholars agree on these things across the board, right? Atheist, agnostic, Jew, Christian. These are just, facts are stubborn things. So these are facts that everyone agrees on. There's good reasons, and we can go through the reasons if you want to. There are actual or good reasons why the 6,000 plus scholars actually agree on all these things. But that's what I'm appealing to make a base argument. Let's say, okay, let's look at the base facts. There's 7 facts, and let's say what's the best explanation. He gave, Peter felt really bad. I mean, he explained Peter with no evidence at all except Robert Price, which also is an appeal to authority. I don't see, where the arguments are against my 7 facts.
I ask in part because it seems like with equivocation, he might be making 2 different cases and presenting it under the same term. And from what I can tell, the case he makes could actually be compatible with a very powerful God who operates on a moral plane that he doesn't understand and he's very offended by.
Exactly.
But he's still Lord. And so his whole case could be broadly true. Inerrancy could be conceded for the sake of argument, and your case still stands compatible.
Yeah.
Okay.
But to his point, I mean, I think the debate, Lord or legend, I made a case for the Lord, he made a case for legend, so, we weren't able to address everyone's arguments, I guess.
All right, for real. Last question.
Okay.
Mr. Barker.
For real. My last name is Barker too. Woo. So I have comments for Justin and then a question, and I'll be fast. I have kids. I know how to be fast. So, Justin, I'm not sure that Peter's willingness to die for his God and other Christians like him is the best argument for Christians to use.
Say that again. Can you start over? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm not sure that, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
That Peter's willingness to die for his God and other Christians like him is the best argument for Christians to use. The 9/11 terrorists were willing to die with hopes of eternal reward and bliss, and that's just one example of many. Also, you said that agnostics are atheists without balls. First of all, that's sexist. Secondly...
Hey, it was Stephen Colbert, so get on Stephen Colbert. I quoted him.
Well, not worth quoting.
Who doesn't like Stephen Colbert? That's insane.
Secondly, I think those who can admit, I don't know, are wise and humble. It's what every one of us should be vulnerable enough to admit and open enough to learn and be wrong. And my question.
Good point.
People like my husband have come to faith and experienced freedom, and I respect that. I've left the faith and experienced freedom. Dan, what first sparked your journey towards atheism?
Oh, that's a long story. I was a preacher. You can read my story in the book Godless.
I was just curious about maybe if there was like that first thing.
Well, yeah, because I was, as Justin points out, a fundamentalist inerrantist. So when my reliability in the scripture became compromised, for example, Adam and Eve, were Adam and Eve historical people? That to me was a big deal. I met Christians who didn't think Adam and Eve were historical because they couldn't have been with what we know about evolution. There couldn't have been a first man and a first woman. And even if there were, they wouldn't have come out of the Middle East, they would have come out of Africa. So, and I remember thinking things like that, which didn't turn me into an atheist. I mean, you don't just overnight just go, oh, silly me, there's no God, how could I have been so stupid? But it was about a 4 or 5 year process that started with the Bible and realizing, well, then if there's metaphor in the Bible, if the prodigal son is a parable, which is a story that Jesus made up, and it's okay, you can make up stories, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, then maybe God himself is just one huge metaphor. Maybe God himself is just one huge human invention that the Israelites came up with to try to give some meaning to the origin of life. And so a lot of those things played into it. That's oversimplifying, but it was primarily intellectual. And later, after I left the faith, then the moral and emotional parts of it came into play. But it was primarily a question of, is it true? It's not true.
Thank you.
I wonder if Dan would have stayed a Christian if he had known that you could believe in the resurrection without believing in inerrancy. Is that possible?
No, there's a lot more to it than that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, to a fundamentalist like me, that needed the Bible to be absolutely reliable, to learn that some places are not, and you even hint that it's possible that there are mistakes in the Bible, which doesn't compromise your faith. That's more moderate and more liberal Christians, the way they talk about. They don't care if there's mistakes or contradictions in the Bible.
I believe in inerrancy, but it's more informed inerrancy, right? It understands that, like Matthew and Luke, for example, can use Mark in ways that might, for like you said, someone who's a fundamentalist might think, oh, that's a straight contradiction, but not understand how these genres are working and how these gospel writers are working.
But like
it has to do with the intent of the author, with informed inerrancy.
I know that, and context, and the meanings of the words, but you heard me say repeatedly that my decision is a probabilistic one.
Right.
So there might be a God. My probability of a God existing is probably 0.05 or something, but I'm open. Are you open to the possibility that there is no God and that your faith is wrong?
Oh, I'd love for you to answer my 7 facts.
But are you open?
Oh, I'm definitely open, yeah.
So there might not be a God.
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I'd put it at 5%. We could be in the matrix and maybe.
So we're about the same flip of each other. Okay. Well, that's honest. A lot of Christians won't even say that much.
Oh, yeah,
they know for sure in their heart that God exists.
I put it at 95%.
All right.
Go ahead.
95% is pretty good.
My question is, when the person who said that Paul and these 500 people saw God, who says that he couldn't just be making this up? And scholars, most of them that you are talking about are Christians and believe in these facts, but believing most times is not the truth. I'm pretty sure about this, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Vikings used to think that solar eclipses were caused by this ancient wolf god, not the moon, but now we know that it is in fact the moon that causes a solar eclipse.
Okay, I kind of lost the last one. Something people believe, something that was weird that they don't believe anymore, right? Something Vikings
it
believe
wasn't
something.
the truth. The Vikings believed that
So
solar
the
eclipse
thing
was
about
causing
so that was similar to a question that was asked before. The reason why we trust Paul, now again, that Paul is trustworthy, that is what is established by the strictest historical method, just like Josephus in most places is trustworthy about AD 70, what happened when the temple was destroyed. Tacitus is trustworthy as a Roman historian. Paul is extremely, at the highest probability of history, as certain as you can be, according to all these scholars, when it comes to Galatians 1, Galatians 2, 1 Corinthians 15, these early letters, Paul is trustworthy. So the question is...
I'm saying that the person who says that Paul did this...
Well, Paul said that. Paul says this. That's what I'm saying. Paul is the eyewitness. He actually says, I saw Jesus, and he says that you can interview. He says, I went and spent time with Peter. I went and spent time with James, the brother of Jesus. He appeals to the fact that some of these 500 people are still alive. And he does that according to all these same scholars. If you read any commentary on 1 Corinthians, because You could go and interview them. You can go talk to them. That's what Paul means. You can go talk to people who saw Jesus.
How do you know that the people that you're interviewing are not just making this up as well? In my point earlier that they do believe this, but believing is not the truth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. But like I said, it's a cumulative case. So you have all these other facts that are involved. So you have Jesus' death. You have this explosion of the Christian movement that began within the very place he died. What's in between, right? I mean, we all hear about Bill Cosby, right? He's got, 4,000 women that are accusing him of something, right? So when you have that many people saying that this person did something, if you had just 2, maybe he didn't do it, right? Maybe the people are lying. But when you have tons, I mean, there's 40 women are saying that Bill Cosby did this. When you have a lot of fire, when you have a lot of smoke, there must be a fire. And so that's what I'm saying. So what happened?
For example, about the solar eclipses, most of the Vikings did believe that the solar eclipse is caused by this wolf god.
Right, but they were stupid.
Blocking out the sun. But as I said,
again,
it proved to be the moon. So
yeah. So
what?
What? So show me an example.
That all these people that you were interviewing are believing this, but it is just in fact not true.
Yeah, so a good parallel with the Vikings would be show me where the scholars are unanimous, atheist, agnostic, where you got the Bart Ehrmans, you got the Maurice Casey, you got all the scholars agreeing that these Vikings saw this 500 plus witnesses. You got nothing like that. I mean, they believed weird things. People believed in Thor, people believed in weird things. There's definitely evidence of weird beliefs among humanity throughout the history of the world, right? But the question is who was Jesus, right? I mean, why has Jesus made such a footprint? Why has he impacted the world? Why does a third of the world still worship him as God, worship him as Lord? Why did that happen? And I'm going back to the very beginning and saying this is why it happened, because he bodily rose from the dead.
So I would only...
You're a smart young man. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Be a questioner. Be skeptical. I think if you be skeptical, if you be a doubting Thomas, you'll end up like doubting Thomas at the feet of Jesus saying, my Lord and my God.
A lot of
that's
us
where doubting Thomas ended up.
I highly doubt I will.
But I think we should at least make it clear that although scholars believe that Paul believed what he wrote,
right.
The 500 witnesses was secondhand. Paul said he got this from someone else. So someone told Paul that they were 500 witnesses, and Paul is merely repeating that formula. So that weakens the probability a little bit more. Paul did not know those 500 people. Or we don't know that he didn't know some of them.
The fact that he feels that some of them are alive, that's strong evidence that and we already talked about how Peter and James are going back and forth from Corinth and Jerusalem.
But
So
still,
we know
it's
that there's this
secondhand.
travel.
He might have been told that some of them were alive. We don't know for sure that Paul himself
Seems
actually...
like you have a hermeneutic of suspicion here.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Skepticism is a highly important position to take.
But only with Paul's letters for some reason. Yeah. Only things in the Bible.
I never said that. That's not fair, Justin.
Last question from the floor, Peter.
Okay, I thought I wasn't going to be able to ask my question, so it's awesome that I finally got up here. So this 500 witnesses thing and these 7 facts, I'm sorry I kind of came in late, but the 7 facts, are those... I
can say them again for you if you want.
Are those associated with Habermas, Gary Habermas?
No, these are my...
Okay. So you say that there's 6,000 scholars...
I'm going off of just Paul's letters.
Okay, so you say there's 6,000 scholars who say that these 500 eyewitnesses were people that Paul personally thought, okay, these 500 witnesses
that
are
Paul
people I knew.
is trustworthy in his testimony.
That he's trustworthy in his witness testimony that there's these 500. Okay, so I did some quick internet research to try to figure out, like, is this really a universal thing as far as are these 500 witnesses, legitimate? And I found something by, again, Robert Price, but he also quotes Bultmann and he quotes a couple other individuals. It's kind of a longer passage. But he basically says the same thing that you just accused Dan Barker of making up, which is that this is probably a secondhand source, and he's quoting other individuals in this too. I'm wondering if you came across this view as well, that this is probably a secondary source that Paul has read maybe from a source similar to the Acts of the Apostles, along those lines, that he's heard from somebody else that he's passing down as an apologetics device to say, okay, there's these 500 witnesses out there, you can ask them, therefore what I'm saying is completely legitimate. I'm wondering if you've come across this source at all, or?
Okay, good stuff. You came in a little late, so just so you know, when I said the 6,000 plus scholars, I was talking about full-time teaching. So Robert Price would be the one of the two only Jesus mythicists who they're not full-time teachers, and they do have credentials in these areas, but they're not full-time teachers. So that's why they're not a part of that 6,000. But the reason why we know that's not true is because Paul is, he testifies in Galatians 1 and 2 that he went and spent time with Peter and with James and these earliest apostles within Jerusalem. And again, all scholars agree that that is bedrock historical truth that Paul is doing. And there's real good reasons for that, because Paul is defending his apostleship against these false apostles who are saying he's a false apostle. That's one of the main reasons why he wrote Galatians. And so he was there. So he probably talked to a lot of these 500. That's why he was able probably to say, hey, some of them have died, but some of them are still alive. You can go talk to them.
Because I think it's interesting, because he quotes like a scholar named E.L. Allen. Is that a full-time?
I'd have to look him up. Usually mythicists quote other mythicists, but I'd have to check.
Or and he quotes Sider, and he quotes Bultmann, and he quotes
Wait, say Bultmann? B-U-L-T-M-A-N-N?
Bultmann, yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, he definitely agrees. Yeah, see, what's amazing thing about Bultmann is he's one of the most skeptical New Testament scholars of the last 300 years.
He's part-time as well.
Oh, well, he's full-time. He's dead. I mean, he was a German scholar of the 19th century. But Bultmann believed that basically nothing. I mean, he was one of the reasons why there was a no quest for the historical Jesus. I mean, we can't know anything about Jesus, but we do know these certain facts. And these facts that I'm talking about, Bultmann would even agree with.
Now, so because you're saying that Paul is such a reliable source, I'm wondering, is it universal that people believe these other things, like Paul literally saw, you guys went back and forth, that Paul literally saw the resurrected Christ? Do most scholars believe that Paul is telling the truth when he says he literally saw the resurrected Christ?
You may have been not been here before. Let me quote that one again. A really good word from Paula Friedrichsen, who's an agnostic scholar of the New Testament, one of the top female scholars on the New Testament. She says, I know in their own terms what they saw as the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. So that's been my main question tonight. What did they see? Dan even denied hallucinations. And he came up with a, I think, ad hoc view from Robert Price that Peter, had this sad feeling about Jesus. But it's ridiculous. These earliest Jews, just like all the other 14 movements of Messianic followers, they were convinced when their Messiah died that it was done. For some reason, these followers of Jesus, they started saying he had risen from the dead, which was an absolutely unique belief in all of first century Judaism. What caused that belief? Where did that come from? What did they see, and where did those unique beliefs come from? Okay. Resurrection of Jesus is the best I've found, but maybe you got another one.
And then he also brought up the fact that the hallucinations, there have been like mass sightings of
Well, he rejected hallucinations. He said hallucinations is a good answer.
By the way, I did not reject hallucinations.
I thought you said hallucinations is weak.
Yes, it's weak.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't mean I reject it. There's all these possibilities on the table with some degree of probability or not. And don't think like a binary brain where everything has to be totally true or false. Hallucinations are on the table, although I personally don't think they are as strong as other plausible naturalistic explanations.
And would the resurrection of Jesus answer all 7 of those facts? If Jesus did bodily rise from the dead, would all those facts be explained perfectly?
Well, let me think about that. If the miracle happened, then yes, but it would not mean that it was supernatural or that it was a god or that the biblical writers were correct.
If you accept Jesus rose from the dead tonight, I'll be happy.
I don't accept it. You said if.
Okay, but it's the best explanation of the facts.
No, it's not the best explanation of the facts. Okay. You said if he did.
So what is the best explanation of the facts?
I think the best explanation is what I explained to you earlier about Paul's...
Him feeling bad? Peter feeling bad?
Well, that's oversimplifying it. You're kind of belittling an important...
I think we should belittle it. It's something that Robert Price just
made up. I think we should equally belittle talking snakes and walking on the water and ascensions into heaven. If you're going to belittle things, let's belittle the absurd stories that appear in the Bible. Because those stories...
More issues of inerrancy, the reason why you left the faith. Why didn't you deal with the actual bedrock facts of the faith?
I didn't deny all of those facts. I said their probability is weaker. That's all I said.
Because-
Please don't paint your opponent as being black and white on these issues. That doesn't do yourself any service. Let's talk about it rationally as a matter of probabilities. Even you admit that there's a 5% possibility that there is no God. I respect that. I admire that. I ask you to do the same thing to me when I make my...
I'm just looking for a good answer
All right, okay.
to answer the facts. I mean, I just
You
have
don't
no-
need a perfect answer. You
Not a
just
perfect
need...
answer, just a good answer. The Peter feeling bad isn't even a good answer.
Yes, it is. It's a great answer.
No, it's not a good
It's a
answer.
great answer,
It's
by
an
the
awful
way.
answer. There's no evidence.
I'm
for it.
sorry. It's a great
What's
answer.
the evidence? Show
It's
me.
a- it
What's
is
the
a-
evidence?
The fact...
Other than Robert Price. You read that in Robert Price's book. That's all you know.
Listen to this, Justin. The fact that there do exist, however improbable, plausible naturalistic explanations for an event like that drastically weakens the probability that the miraculous answer is the right one. You have to admit that, even though you don't like those answers.
But see,
it's
I'm
a natural answer.
I'm a free thinker. I have all the options on the table.
But isn't a natural answer more likely?
God doing miracles is on the table for me. Is it on the table for you?
Yeah, it's on the table for me
okay,
too.
so you already agreed that the best explanation for the facts is that God raised Jesus
No,
from the dead.
I don't.
You said that explains all the facts perfectly.
No, I didn't say it was the best.
But you said it explains
I
all the
said
facts perfectly.
If my hypothesis is true, then it explains all the facts
No,
as
it
well.
doesn't. It explains
yes,
Peter.
It does.
How does that explain Paul? Why would Paul be crying in a
Because
basement
Paul
somewhere?
believed what Peter said.
Paul believed Paul was trying to kill the Christians. We know
Paul
that.
later had this experience, whatever you call it, schizophrenic, whatever, of a visionary experience.
So he
and
wasn't
later
crying. He wasn't
believed-
feeling bad.
Yeah, well, Paul's experience might be totally different, but in any event, a plausible naturalistic explanation, no matter how unlikely, is much better than a supernatural explanation.
Sounds like anti-supernatural bias.
No, it isn't. It's a matter of probabilities. It's not a bias.
I think you should follow the evidence where it leads.
Don't accuse me of having a bias when I don't. Miracles could have happened, but they are less likely than a
Could
naturalistic
it have happened in
explanation.
this situation?
It could have happened in anyone. This could be a
What
miracle.
evidence would have convinced you that it happened here? What more would you want than the
I
seven
would
facts
want
that we
more
have?
than what we have.
Then what? Give me an example.
I would want evidence that people do in fact rise from the dead.
Okay, so someone else has to rise from the dead for you to believe Jesus rose from the dead.
No, I would. The probability of a person rising from the dead. The only way to get a probability is to divide one number by another. If you have one example in the all
But
of
give me
history,
something from history that if you had all this evidence from history, you would be convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. What would convince you?
well, there would be, as I said earlier, there would be external confirmation during the time Jesus lived by other people who were not believers, other disinterested people. I mean, that would be an amazing thing. Philo of Judea.
So like Paul?
And Justice of
So like
Tiberius.
Paul?
No, not Paul. Paul
Paul
wrote
wasn't
his
a
things.
disinterested
He
person?
wrote that after he was a believer.
Right,
He wrote those things.
but all scholars agree, and you agreed that he changed, right? He was an unbeliever, and he became a
Yeah,
believer.
he had
He's
some
disinterested,
experience.
correct?
He had some experience on the road to Damascus.
Okay, so
So
sounds like
if-
some of your evidence is being supplied by my
If
facts.
Philo, who wrote in great detail in that time of history about that area of the world, if he had said anything about Jesus or the eclipse or the earthquakes or any of that
So
stuff.
Josephus' references to Jesus isn't enough for you?
No, Josephus was much, much later, and we know that his passage about Jesus was doctored. We
No,
know
no.
that. Yes,
No,
we do.
no.
Yes. I'm
What?
sorry.
No, you're completely wrong with the brother of James. That is not doctored according to anyone,
Yes.
except maybe mythicists. Maybe mythicists say
Well,
that. But no one says that.
Wait a
That's
minute.
an actual scholar.
Why is it by
of
just
Josephus.
simply labeling somebody a mythicist that automatically discounts it? The mythicists are on the table as well.
They're
they
on the
are
table.
scholars.
Oh, yes. Are they?
Yes.
Okay, but teaching scholars. Are they teaching scholars?
What does that matter? What do you mean teaching scholars? A lot of teaching scholars are horrible.
Okay.
What does that matter?
What does that matter?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So if you got cancer, if you got some sort of disease, and you needed to investigate from the experts what you need to know about that disease, would you just read blogs? Would you just read self-published books, or would you look at the experts?
I would consider an expert who has a PhD
really?
in the languages,
Okay.
who has studied it.
And how many of the mythicists have PhD in these credentials?
Well, at least Robert Price.
Okay,
does.
so
you
two.
know that.
Two.
Well, so he's on the table.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't take him off
Okay,
the
so
table.
so you put Robert Price against the 6,000.
I would put him on the table with the 6,000.
Right.
As
And it
weakening
seems like you're
the.
putting major emphasis on him, again, with no evidence. I asked for evidence for why Peter, where's the evidence that Peter was crying and feeling bad that Jesus
Well, we do know
died?
the disciples were distraught. Don't we know that?
Yeah,
We
they were
do
distraught
know-
because he wasn't the Messiah. They
Exactly.
didn't believe he was the Messiah anymore.
And we do know that Peter had denied the Lord. We do know he was a hot-tempered person. He chopped off an ear of one of the guards. We do know
So you
kind of
believe
stuff.
those events are historical?
If those are true, it leads to something about his personality and his psychology. We can't psychoanalyze Peter now, but on the table is a valid naturalistic hypothesis.
I haven't heard one that answers all the set facts.
That does answer
You
all
talked
the
about
facts.
Peter, but
I'm
not
sorry.
Let's
Paul.
conclude with closing statements. Mr. Barker?
All right. So our debate tonight was about legend and Lord. It was two different topics. So, you know, I can see in retrospect I should have spent more time on the legend side of things, but at least I presented the naturalistic case for legend, and even a small probabilistic case for myth, although you heard me say that I agree that we can't know for certain either way, up or down. And even Justin agrees with that. But this whole idea of Lord, this whole idea that somebody would be a Lord, that we need a Lord somehow to worship, that's an ancient, primitive idea. Here we live in a country that is proudly rebellious. We kicked out the king, the monarch, the sovereign, the Lord, the dictator, the person up there hovering over us, telling us little toddlers what the Father wants us to do. This whole idea of bowing and prostrating and even asking if Jesus is Lord really is kind of a psychological question. It's not really a question of, you know, the fact that there are people who want to have a Lord at all, the fact that there are people who think I need to worship and bow down before some master, it's not only un-American, whether that's relevant or not, but it's insulting to our species. Have you ever looked at the postures of prayer? The postures of prayer are identical with the postures of slavery. The wrists are shackled, the head is bowed, you're down, you're telling the master how great thou art and how nothing I am. I think that is horribly insulting. Even if Jesus did exist, even if I agreed with Justin 100%, yep, he rose from the dead, yep, there's a God, yep, I don't deny any of that, that does not mean that he is my Lord. I would, if he did exist and he created this hell that I'm going to have to go to, then let him prove to me what a huge macho man he is and send me to hell. I will go happily to hell. It would be worse of a hell for me to bow down before a Lord who would create a place like hell. That's the point I was trying to make. Regardless of the legend and historicity issue, that's a different issue. Even if I agreed 100%, I would still reject that being as the Lord of my life because I'm better than that. And if the only way he deals with us is with violence and with a lake of fire and gnashing of teeth, figurative or not, if that's the only way he deals with us, then we are nothing. We may as well not have even lived at all. I have the freedom to choose, and based on what I read in the Bible, and based about what I see about church history, I cannot accept Jesus as Lord. Now, if you want to say that he's Lord anyway because he's the man, might makes right, he's got the power to give life and take life, fine. He still has not won me over as a follower of him. I think your mentality, and I think the mentality of most believers, is totally upside down. We should do what the U.S. Constitution did. Instead of having our government with a sovereign monarch lord, what we did is we turned it upside down and said, no, there's no above Lord. We the people, we think for ourselves bottom up. We make our decisions as free individuals, not by coercion of hell or by some moral threats from some father figure who wants to tell us how to live our lives. I think we don't have purpose-driven life. I think we have life-driven purpose. And that comes much more freely. You're much more free to live and enjoy your life, unshackled from the demands or the childish toddler needs to have some Lord of your life. And that's the point I wanted to emphasize. Maybe we should have split this into two debates. But to me, I think that's more important than all this historicity stuff, which you heard me admit is a matter of probabilities. I might be wrong. I'd be happy to admit I'm wrong. That still doesn't mean that Jesus is Lord. He is not the Lord of my life and the life of many other non-believers in this world.
Dan Barker. Thank you, sir.
Well, I look at it a little differently. I look at it as this Lord, Jesus, came down and died, lived a perfect sinless life, and he died. He loved us so much that he died on the cross for our sins, that he rose again from the dead, and that he wants us to have this eternal relationship with us, that we are his creatures, and he created us. And what I've heard from you, even if he rose from the dead, you still wouldn't accept him as Lord. I think that's I think
Yeah.
that's telling. So I would challenge
I'm proud of
everyone
that,
here. I've laid out 7 unalterable bedrock facts that I think if you follow the evidence where it leads, you will see that the best evidence, I think that the best explanation of those 7 facts is that Jesus did in fact bodily rise again from the dead. And so I ask you, I commend that to you. If Jesus did rise from the dead, is he someone that you want to listen to? And look at his life. Look at his life. I think 90% of what Dan said about Jesus was completely just misrepresented, taking scripture out of context. Look at Jesus. Look at the way he lived, how he loved his enemies, how he died for them, how he said, turn the other cheek, the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Just look at this Jesus. Is this the kind of person you want to follow? I'm not really interested in heaven. I'm looking forward to being with this Jesus. Whoever he is, I want to know him. I want to be with him forever. This is what excites me about the next life of experiencing this Lord that I experience now, but that I will one day know for all eternity. Read the New Testament for yourself and ask yourself if he really could be the Son of God and Lord of your life. And get some books on these subjects. I would highly recommend some of the top ones that I've recommended before: Augustine's Confessions, Pascal's Pensées, Chesterton's Orthodoxy, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and a more recent one, Tim Keller's Reason for God. I think these are great, excellent books that demonstrate what real Christianity is. I think we've heard from Dan challenges to very fundamentalist type Christianity, the kind of Christianity he left. But if you want real Christianity, I challenge you to read people like Augustine and people like Aquinas and people like Anselm and people like Luther and Calvin and Pascal and C.S. Lewis. Christianity is either the greatest hoax ever conjured up or it is the greatest story ever told. You want this to be true. Thank God it is true. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you all very much.
You're so far away, and I won't see you any day soon. We came a long way, now you wanna fly to the moon. All alone, going your own way. I thought I owned your love, and now you say, ache beautiful for me. Go along and ache beauty, babe. Thought love was here to stay for years, but now it's down to days. And it's one long day to Heathrow from a Humboldt Bay. Love was a song we sang so beautifully. And can it be gone permanently? And you say, ache beautiful for me. Come along and ache beauty, baby. Yeah, ache beautiful. But all this heart can do is break. So take a piece. Yeah.